Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to have you back on Midnight Stories. So take a moment to unwind, sit back, and immerse yourself in the captivating tale that awaits. However, before we begin, I kindly ask for your support by giving us a like. I was 2 months into my assignment at a state park in Montana when I figured it'd be the perfect time to start driving deeper into the trails. I had no idea I'd be doing more than looking for lost hikers. In 1993, I hadn't expected much beyond the usual. Torn tents, runaway dogs, maybe a couple of teenagers who didn't pay attention to the posted trail signs. I've been a park ranger for about 7 years, but nothing from the previous ones prepared me for what happened next. You know, I'm the type who always found solace in nature. I joke about it. How the trees never judged you, how the birds didn't care if you showed up with a bad haircut or not. I grew up in Chicago, surrounded by concrete, so getting out into the wilderness was always my escape. Out here it's peaceful, except for that time when things got complicated. I'm not sure if complicated really covers it, though. Maybe I should start at the point when things went sideways. It was a regular Tuesday and I was cruising through a part of the park that doesn't see a lot of traffic. You've got your popular tourist routes, but this one was off the beaten path. The whole stretch of trail looked like it had been forgotten. Not a bad spot if you're someone who doesn't want to be found, I suppose. I was out there checking up on a report about some abandoned gear left near a cabin, something people said had been there for weeks. Nothing too unusual. Campers leave stuff behind all the time. I parked my truck and hiked in. The cabin was a ways in, tucked behind thick pine trees that seemed to grow denser the deeper I went. I remember thinking it was oddly quiet, not in the way it gets when you're in nature, but like even the birds were too scared to make a sound. Dark humor helps when things get tense, so I joked to myself about some kid scaring the wildlife with a terrible mixtape. But really, it wasn't funny. I could feel it. Something wasn't right. My skin prickled and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up like they were trying to warn me of something. I should have trusted my instincts and left right there, but I was stubborn. The cabin was old, real old. I doubted anyone used it for anything legal anymore, but that didn't mean it was harmless. As I got closer, I saw the gear in a heap near the front door. There were signs that someone had camped there for more than a night. A fire pit with burned-out logs, and what looked like an old leather jacket tossed carelessly to the side. I kicked open the door of the cabin, half expecting to see it trashed, but it wasn't. It was clean. I'm talking cleaner than it should have been for something in the middle of nowhere. No dust, no cobwebs, and definitely no bugs, which in Montana was weird enough. I was thinking about how maybe this was some eccentric's hideout when I heard a crack behind me. I spun around fast, the sound too deliberate to be an animal just wandering by. Now here's the thing. I'm not one of those guys who freaks out at every noise in the woods. But this noise, it wasn't natural. It was like someone or something was walking just out of sight, pacing in a way that set my nerves on edge. Little did I know this was only the beginning, the start of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, one that would change everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and the things that lurk in the shadows of the trees. The cabin door had creaked open wider, and outside something moved between the trees. I stepped out slowly, figuring it was a poacher or some squatter. But I was wrong. What I saw wasn't human, not even close. It was crouched low, its limbs twisted in ways that didn't make sense, long arms that hung too far down almost to the ground, and a torso that looked more animal than man. Its skin was like that of an old deer, stretched too tight over bones that jutted out like daggers. It moved in jerks, like it wasn't used to its own body. And it stank, like rotting meat left out in the sun. I guess that should have been the first clue that this wasn't going to end well. I've seen my fair share of wild animals, but nothing ever made my heart drop like that thing did. It noticed me, its head snapping in my direction. It had teeth, and that's all I could focus on at first. Jagged, broken, and wrong, like they'd been chewed down to points. I made a run for the truck, but it followed. Fast, too fast. There's a funny thing about adrenaline. It doesn't let you think straight. I stumbled, barely making it to my truck, and slammed the door behind me. The creature smashed against the window, its face pressing against the glass. It didn't scream, didn't growl, just made this noise like a rattling. I remember thinking in some stupid corner of my mind that it sounded like someone shaking a tin can full of rocks. I tried to start the truck, but nothing happened. Of course, the engine decided that right then was the perfect time to fail me. The window cracked under the pressure of its fists, because it was hitting the glass with these long, bony fists, and it was smart enough to aim for the weakest part of the truck. I grabbed the flare gun from the passenger seat and shot it straight into its chest. The creature fell back, not dead but pissed off. It howled, clutching at the flare embedded in its skin, and for a second I thought maybe I had a chance. It scrambled away, disappearing into the woods. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. I sat there for a minute catching my breath, hoping the damn truck would start, but it didn't. Then I heard the sounds, more of them, not just one, but several. It was like I'd kicked over a nest. I could hear them moving through the trees, circling. That's when I realized why the gear had been left behind. Whoever was out here before me, they didn't leave by choice. I grabbed my radio, trying to call for backup, but all I got was static. Figures. I'd heard the stories about people disappearing in these woods, but I always figured it was because they got lost or didn't know how to handle the elements. Now I wasn't so sure. They were getting closer. I don't know how many, but I heard them, too many to fight off alone, so I did the only thing I could. I bailed, running like a maniac through the woods, the sounds of those things chasing me. I could feel the ground shaking under their weight, hear their breath coming out in ragged gasps. I swear, one of them was close enough to claw at the back of my shirt, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. By the time I got back to the nearest outpost, I was bleeding, limping, and scared out of my mind. The other rangers thought I was crazy, said I must have imagined it, but they hadn't seen what I had. They hadn't heard that rattling noise or smelled the rot. I wasn't about to go back out there to prove it, though. I figured I'd let someone else be the hero. Little did I know my nightmare was far from over. A week later, a group of campers went missing. Their gear was found near that same cabin, torn apart, bloodstains leading off into the woods, but no bodies, just a few scraps of fabric and footprints. Too big to be human. The park shut down that section for a while, said it was for maintenance, but I know better. They don't want anyone else to see what I saw. Whatever those things were, they're still out there. I don't know if they're animals or something worse, but they're hunting, and they're good at it. That's all I've got to say. Maybe next time I'll listen to my instincts before I go looking for trouble in the middle of nowhere. But the thing is, trouble has a way of finding you, even when you're not looking for it, especially in those woods. I couldn't shake what I'd seen. It haunted me, like a splinter in my mind. I'd close my eyes and see those long, twisted limbs, hear the rattling breath, smell the decay. It was like the creature had left a piece of itself with me, a shadow I couldn't escape. I tried to go back to work to pretend everything was normal, but it wasn't. I was jumpy, on edge. Every noise in the woods made me flinch. Every shadow made me reach for my gun. The other rangers noticed, but they didn't say anything. Not at first. It was Chuck, my old buddy from training, who finally pulled me aside. "You all right there, Jake?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "You've been acting weird ever since that day in the woods." I wanted to tell him. I wanted to spill everything, to have someone else know the horror I'd seen. But I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat, choked by the fear that if I said it out loud, it would make it real. So I just shook my head, mumbled something about being tired, and walked away. But Chuck wasn't the type to let things go. He cornered me in the break room a few days later, his face set with determination. "Look, Jake, I know something happened out there. Something bad. And I think I might know what it is." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" He glanced around, making sure we were alone, then leaned in close. "There are stories," he said, his voice low. "Old stories from the native tribes around here. They talk about creatures. Things that aren't human, aren't animal. Things that hunt in the woods." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of things?" Chuck shook his head. "They have a lot of names. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, shapeshifters. But they all have one thing in common. They used to be human, until something changed them." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Changed them how? There are different stories. Some say it's a curse, others say it's a choice, that these people, they did things. bad things, cannibalism, murder, black magic, and it twisted them, turned them into something else, something hungry. I thought back to the creature I'd seen, the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it had chased me, hunted me. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How do we stop them?" Chuck looked at me, his eyes sad. "I don't know if we can, Jake. These things, they're not natural. They don't follow the rules of nature. They're something else entirely." I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. If Chuck, with all his years of experience, didn't know how to fight these things, what chance did I have? But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing, not when I knew what was out there, not when I knew it would kill again. I made a decision then. I was going to find out what these creatures were, and I was going to find a way to stop them, no matter what it took, even if it meant going back into those woods. I started digging into the old stories, the legends Chuck had mentioned. I spent hours in the local library, poring over dusty books and faded newspaper clippings. I talked to the indigenous elders in the nearby reservation, listening to their tales of monsters in the night. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. These creatures, whatever they were, had been around for a long time. There were stories of them going back centuries, always linked to times of great strife or tragedy. There was a pattern to their appearances. They seemed to be drawn to places of death and suffering, like moths to a flame. Battlefields, plague-ridden villages, sites of massacres. Wherever the veil between life and death was thinnest, that's where they'd be. And they were always associated with a single human figure, someone who had committed unspeakable acts, a traitor who led enemies to slaughter his own people, a doctor who experimented on patients, a priest who sacrificed children. It was as if their evil deeds had marked them, turned them into a beacon for these creatures. But the stories weren't clear on what happened next. Some said the person simply disappeared, never to be seen again. Others claimed they returned, but changed, twisted and feral, with a hunger for human flesh. And then there were the darker tales, whispered by firelight in the deep of night, tales of transformation, of the human shape melting away to reveal the monster beneath, of creatures that could take on the appearance of their victims, luring in the unsuspecting with a familiar face. The more I read, the more I felt a creeping sense of dread, because there was one detail that kept coming up, again and again. The creatures always hunted in packs, and they had a leader. In every story, there was one creature that stood out, larger and more vicious than the others, a creature with a malevolent intelligence, a cunning that bordered on the human. It was this creature that directed the hunt, that chose the victims. And it was this creature that I had seen in the woods that day, leading the others in their chase. I knew then that I was up against something far beyond my experience, my training. This wasn't a bear or a mountain lion, something that could be tricked or scared off. This was a predator that had been honing its skills for centuries, a creature of nightmare and shadow. But I also knew I couldn't turn back, because now I had a suspicion, a terrible thought that wouldn't let me rest. What if the creatures weren't just drawn to places of death? What if they caused them? What if their appearance was the omen, the harbinger of tragedy to come? I thought of all the disappearances in the park over the years, the hikers that had vanished without a trace. Had they fallen victim to these creatures? And if so, how many more would follow? I had to find out. I had to know for sure. And there was only one way to do that. I had to go back to the cabin, back to where it all began. And this time, I wouldn't be running away. I'd be setting a trap. The plan was simple, in theory. I would go back to the cabin, but this time I'd be prepared. I'd learned that these creatures had weaknesses. They didn't like fire, and they could be hurt by silver. So I loaded up on flares, on silver bullets for my gun. I even melted down some old silver jewelry to make arrowheads just in case. I knew I couldn't do it alone, so I enlisted Chuck. He was hesitant at first, but when I showed him what I'd found, the evidence I'd gathered, he couldn't deny it anymore. He agreed to come with me to watch my back. We set out at dawn before the rest of the rangers arrived. We didn't want anyone else involved, anyone else at risk. This was our fight. The woods were quiet as we hiked in, the only sound the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves. But it was a watchful quiet, a tense quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I could feel the weight of the silver bullets in my pocket, the cold metal of the flare gun in my hand. It was a small comfort against the growing sense of unease. We reached the cabin by midday. It looked the same as it had before, deceptively peaceful in the dappled sunlight. But now I knew what lurked in the shadows. We set up camp in a clearing nearby, close enough to keep an eye on the cabin, but far enough away to have some warning if the creatures approached. And then we settled in to wait. The hours crawled by, the sun sinking slowly towards the horizon. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us tense, made us reach for our weapons, but nothing came. Night fell, and with it, a deep, impenetrable darkness. We kept the fire low, not wanting to attract attention, huddling close to its meager warmth. And then, just as I was starting to think maybe we'd been wrong, maybe the creatures had moved on, we heard it. A rattling breath, a sound like bones clattering together, and then a scream, high and terrified, coming from the direction of the cabin. We were on our feet in an instant, guns drawn, flares at the ready. We moved towards the sound, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging. And there, in the clearing in front of the cabin, we saw them. A group of hikers, 3 men and a woman, backed up against the wall of the cabin, and surrounding them, cutting off any escape, the creatures. They were just as I remembered, long-limbed and skeletal, their skin pulled tight over jagged bones. But now, in the flickering light of the hikers' dropped flashlights, I could see more details. The ragged remnants of clothing hanging off their frames, the glint of something like intelligence in their sunken eyes. And in front of them, larger and more grotesque than the others, the leader. It stood tall, its head swiveling towards us as we burst into the clearing, its maw opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. For a moment we all stood frozen, human and creature alike. And then the leader let out a roar that shook the trees, a sound of pure, primal hunger. And then the creatures attacked. They moved with a speed that defied belief, leaping towards us with claws outstretched. I fired my flare gun, the bright red light illuminating the scene in stark, horrific detail. The flare struck one of the creatures in the chest, setting its ragged clothing alight. It howled in pain, stumbling back. But the others kept coming. Chuck and I stood our ground, firing silver bullets into the mass of limbs and teeth. We aimed for the leader, knowing if we could take it down the others might scatter, but it was fast, dodging our shots with a twisted grace. It lashed out with a clawed hand, catching Chuck across the chest. He cried out, falling back, his gun dropping from his hand. I stood over him, firing frantically, trying to drive the creatures back, but there were too many, coming at us from all sides. I heard the hikers screaming, saw them trying to make a run for it in the chaos. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the leader make its move. It leapt towards the fleeing hikers, its jaws wide, ready to tear into flesh. I didn't think, I just acted. I charged forward, tackling the creature in midair. We tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs, its fetid breath hot on my face. It was strong, stronger than anything I'd ever fought. But I had desperation on my side. I had the knowledge of what this thing was, what it had done. I had the rage of every victim it had ever claimed. I wrestled with it on the forest floor, rolling over dead leaves and snapping twigs. I could hear Chuck shouting, hear the hikers' panicked cries. But it all seemed distant, drowned out by the pounding of my own heart. The creature's claws raked down my back, shredding through my jacket, my skin. I screamed in pain, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. My hand scrabbled in the dirt, searching for a weapon, anything to fight back with. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic, the silver arrowhead I'd made, fallen from my pocket in the struggle. With a cry of defiance, I plunged the arrowhead into the creature's eye. It shrieked, an unearthly sound of agony, its body convulsing beneath me. I pushed myself off it, stumbling back, gasping for breath. The creature twitched on the ground, dark blood oozing from its ruined eye socket. Around me, the other creatures faltered, seeming to sense the fall of their leader. Some slunk back into the shadows of the trees, others milled about uncertainly, their courage failing without the Alpha's command. I staggered over to Chuck, helping him to his feet. He was bleeding, his shirt torn, but he was alive. We looked at each other, sharing a moment of grim triumph, but it was short-lived. Because even as we watched, the wounded leader began to change, its limbs contorted, bones snapping and reforming, its skin rippled, features shifting. And then, Where the creature had been, a man lay gasping on the bloodied leaves. A man I recognized. It was one of the missing hikers from a month ago, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes wide with horror. He looked up at us, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. And then he spoke, his voice a ragged whisper. "Please," he croaked, "please, kill me." We stared at the man, shock rooting us to the spot. He was barely recognizable as human, his body emaciated, his skin stretched tight over jutting bones. But it was his eyes that truly horrified me. They were filled with a desperate, pleading anguish, the eyes of a man who had seen the depths of hell. "Please," he rasped again, "end it, before it takes me again." I looked at Chuck, saw my own confusion and revulsion mirrored in his face. What did he mean, before it took him again? And then, with a sickening lurch of understanding, I remembered the stories, the legends of people who had committed terrible acts, who had been transformed into something monstrous. Was that what had happened to this man? Had he done something so awful that he had become one of them? I swallowed hard, my mind reeling. If that was true, then ending his life would be a mercy. It would be freeing him from an existence of endless torment, of being trapped in a nightmare made flesh. But could I do it? Could I look into the eyes of a fellow human being and pull the trigger? My hand shook as I raised my gun, the barrel wavering. The man watched me, his gaze unflinching, almost expectant. "Do it," he whispered. "Please, while I'm still me." I took a deep breath, my finger tightening on the trigger. But before I could make the choice, a chorus of rattling breaths filled the clearing. The other creatures were emerging from the trees, dozens of them, their movements jerky and unnatural. They seemed agitated, unsettled by the fall of their leader. The man on the ground let out a choked sob. "No," he moaned. "No, not again, not again." And to my horror, I saw his body begin to change, his limbs elongating, his skin shifting. He was transforming before my eyes, becoming one of them once more. Chuck grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We have to go," he yelled over the growing snarls of the creatures. "Now!" I stumbled after him, my heart pounding, my mind numb with horror. We crashed through the undergrowth, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, until the sounds of the creatures faded into the distance. And then we collapsed, gasping and shaking, in a small hollow beneath a towering oak. For a long time, we didn't speak, couldn't speak. The enormity of what we had just seen, what we had learned, weighed down on us like a physical thing. Finally, Chuck broke the silence. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice hollow. I shook my head at a loss. How could we possibly stop this? How could we fight against something that could turn people into monsters? But even as despair threatened to engulf me, a small, stubborn flame of determination sparked to life in my chest. We had to try. We had to find a way. Because if we didn't, how many more would fall victim to this nightmare? How many more would be lost to the darkness in the woods? I stood up, my legs shaky, but my resolve firm. "We go back," I said. "We go back, and we find out everything we can about these creatures, their origins, their weaknesses, and then we fight." Chuck looked at me, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He nodded, pushing himself to his feet. "All right," he said, "let's do this, for the ones we couldn't save, and for the ones we still can." Together, battered but unbroken, we turned our faces towards the unknown, towards the heart of the nightmare, and we walked back into the woods. The next few weeks were a blur of research and preparation. We pored over ancient texts, consulted with tribal elders, tracked down obscure historical records. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. The creatures, it seemed, were a manifestation of a very old, very dark kind of magic. A magic born of blood and suffering, of the darkest aspects of the human soul. The legends spoke of a ritual, a way for a person to shed their humanity and become something other. It required an act of unspeakable evil, a betrayal of the deepest kind, and it bound the person's soul to the dark spirits of the forest, turning them into a conduit for their insatiable hunger. But there was hope, slim though it might be. The stories also spoke of a way to break the curse, to sever the bond between human and beast. It required a sacrifice, a willing soul to take the creature's place. It was a daunting prospect, a burden I couldn't imagine bearing. But the alternative was unthinkable. Armed with this knowledge, Chuck and I set out once more. This time, we weren't just trying to survive. We were on a mission. We tracked the creatures to their lair deep in the woods, a place of shadow and decay where the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. We could feel the malevolence in the air, the weight of centuries of pain and rage. The creatures were waiting for us, the transformed hiker at their head. In the dappled light filtering through the canopy, I could see the agony in his eyes, the silent plea for release. I stepped forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. In my hand, I held an ancient talisman, a relic passed down through generations of tribal shamans. It was the key, they had told us, to breaking the curse. The creatures snarled and hissed, their claws flexing, ready to tear me apart. But I stood my ground, holding the talisman high. I began to chant, the words strange and heavy on my tongue. They were words of power, of cleansing and renewal, words to break the chains of darkness. As I spoke, the talisman began to glow, a pure, silvery light that seemed to pierce the gloom of the forest. The creatures shrank back, hissing in pain and fear, and then, one by one, they began to change. It was like watching a time-lapse in reverse, the monstrous forms melting away to reveal the human beings trapped within. Men and women blinking in the sudden light, their faces etched with confusion and dawning horror. But even as the others transformed, the hiker remained, his body twisting and contorting. He let out a howl of despair, a sound that cut me to the core. I knew then what I had to do, the sacrifice the story spoke of. It had to be me. I stepped forward, the talisman burning cold against my palm. The hiker looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "Take me," I whispered. "Let him go." The light from the talisman intensified, engulfing me, engulfing the hiker. I felt a wrenching sensation, a tearing away of something vital. And then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, the world had changed. The colors were muted, the scents sharp and overwhelming. I could feel the hunger gnawing at my insides, the rage simmering in my veins, but I could also feel the hiker's presence, a warmth and gratitude that suffused my being. He was free. They were all free, except for me. I looked at Chuck, saw the horror and grief in his eyes. "Go," I rasped, my voice guttural and strange. "Get them out of here." He hesitated, tears streaming down his face. "Jake." "Go," I roared, the sound echoing through the trees. He went, leading the dazed and staggering survivors out of the darkness of the forest, out of the reach of the nightmare. I watched them go, feeling a distant pang of longing. But it was overshadowed by the hunger, the insatiable need clawing at my soul. I turned and loped off into the depths of the woods, my form melting and shifting into something lean and predatory, something no longer human. I am the watcher now, the guardian of the forest's dark secrets. I bear the burden so that others might live, might walk in the light. But sometimes, on the darkest of nights, I allow myself to remember, to feel the echoes of the man I once was, and I howl my grief to the uncaring stars. I've always hated early mornings, not the ones where you get a good breakfast and head into the office, but the ones where you're out in the middle of nowhere, sipping coffee that tastes like dirt and pretending you aren't waiting for something bad to happen. It was in 2001 during one of those mornings that I found myself out in a remote section of New Hampshire, the White Mountains to be exact. Name's Derek Hemsworth. I'm a park ranger here, and today I was partnered up with this guy Pete, one of those old-timers who thinks coffee is breakfast. If I had a nickel for every time Pete started a sentence with "back in my day," I'd be richer than the guy who invented that trendy camping gear everyone buys but never uses. We'd been sent to check out a part of the forest that hadn't been maintained in years. It wasn't on any maps, at least not the new ones. Some hikers had gone missing a few weeks ago. Authorities found their campsite trashed, but no sign of the people. A typical Tuesday, right? Pete and I were cracking jokes as we hiked in. The kind of jokes that probably wouldn't go over well in a crowded room. But when you're stuck out here, dark humor keeps you sane. Pete's classic. If you get lost, just find a bear, let it maul you a little, and someone will surely find the body. Not the kind of joke you share at a family dinner, but it got a laugh from me. We didn't think much about the missing hikers because honestly, people get lost out here all the time. But about an hour into the trail, the light chatter between us died down. Pete, despite his joking nature, was a tracker. He noticed things I didn't, like the way the trees here seemed too close together, or how the ground was unnaturally soft underfoot. It was like walking on a sponge. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no squirrels. Nothing. Pete stopped and looked at me, then squatted to get a closer look at something on the ground. I walked over to him, trying to see what had him so interested. It was a footprint, but not a normal one. At first glance, it looked like a bear's, but something was off. The toes were too long and the shape wasn't right. It was almost like a hand, but bigger, much bigger. I remember Pete standing up, his face losing its usual smirk. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. We kept walking, not saying much. Every once in a while, Pete would stop, look around, and then keep going. The woods felt wrong. It was like being in a place that had been forgotten by the world. No paths, no signs of life, just dense trees and that soft, squishy ground. An oppressive silence hung over everything, as if even the wind didn't dare to stir in this ancient, untouched part of the forest. Pete and I moved cautiously, our eyes darting from tree to tree, half expecting something to leap out at us from the shadows. We were both seasoned rangers, used to the wilderness and all its tricks. But this place, it felt different, like we were trespassing in a world we didn't belong to. Then we came across the campsite, or what was left of it. The tent had been torn apart, sleeping bags shredded like someone had taken a knife to them. Gear was strewn everywhere, as if a tornado had ripped through the small clearing. I looked at Pete, but he was focused on something else. A smell. It wasn't the kind of smell you associate with a campfire or old food left out. This was different. It was metallic, almost like rust, mixed with something rotting. A stench that seemed to seep into your pores and linger there, making your stomach turn. Pete walked around the site, his usual slow, deliberate movements now tinged with a sense of urgency. He crouched down, examining the ground, the shredded tent, the scattered supplies. I stayed back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I noticed something odd about the trees surrounding the campsite. They had scratches on them, deep gouges, like something with claws had been here. But bears don't scratch like that, at least not in this part of the country. These marks were too high, too deliberate, almost as if they were a warning. I glanced back at Pete, about to voice my concerns, but he was gone, vanished into thin air. For a second I thought he had just wandered off, maybe following the trail of whatever made those marks. But then I saw his hat lying on the ground, as if it had been dropped in haste. A chill ran down my spine. Pete never took off his hat. It was like a part of him, as much a part of his uniform as his badge. Seeing it there, abandoned on the forest floor, sent a jolt of fear through me. I called out to him, my voice cracking a little. "Pete! Pete! Where are you?" Nothing. Not even the wind answered. I ran toward where I last saw him, my heart pounding in my chest. I was met with silence. No birds, no animals, not even Pete's voice. Just me, standing in a dead forest, staring at the empty space where Pete had been. I'm not proud of it, but I panicked. I turned and started running back the way we came. My mind was racing. It didn't make sense. Pete couldn't just disappear like that. He was too experienced, too cautious. He wouldn't just wander off without saying anything. But as I ran, I realized something. The ground beneath my feet was different. It wasn't the soft, sponge-like ground we'd been walking on. It was firmer, more solid. Like the earth itself had changed in the short time we'd been here. And then I saw them. Bones, scattered across the forest floor, half buried in the dirt. Some of them looked human, the white of the skull stark against the dark soil. But others, well, I don't know what they were. They were too large to be human, too strangely shaped. Some looked like they could have come from an animal, but not any animal I'd ever seen. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on my back. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I lay there, gasping for breath, staring up at the canopy of trees above me. That's when I heard it, a low, wet sound, like something breathing through mud. It was distant at first, but it was getting closer. I could hear the underbrush rustling, twigs snapping under the weight of something large. I scrambled to my feet, looking around, but I couldn't see anything. The trees were too close together, blocking my view in every direction. The sound was getting louder, closer. Whatever was making it, it was big, and it was coming right for me. I'm not ashamed to admit that I ran. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to meet it. But as I ran, the sounds got louder. Footsteps, heavy and fast, crashing through the underbrush behind me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, dodging trees and jumping over fallen logs. My lungs were burning, my legs aching, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The thing behind me was relentless, its pursuit never wavering. I could hear it, always just behind me, always just out of sight. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually I burst out of the trees and onto an old logging road. I collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air, my legs burning from the effort. I lay there for a while, trying to catch my breath, but the sound didn't stop. It was still coming, and it was getting closer. That's when I saw it. It stepped out of the trees just at the edge of the road. At first I thought it was a bear, but it wasn't. It was bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, its body covered in thick, matted fur. But the worst part was its face. It looked like someone had taken a bear and stretched its features, pulling them into something grotesque and unnatural. Its teeth were long, jagged, and wet with something that glistened in the dim light. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I pushed myself to my feet and ran down the road, not caring where it led. I just knew I had to get away from that thing. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It couldn't be real. Things like that didn't exist outside of horror stories and bad dreams. But the sound of its pursuit, the heavy thud of its footsteps on the gravel behind me, was all too real. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. It was closer now, close enough that I could see the glint of its eyes, the way its mouth hung open as it ran, revealing a maw full of razor-sharp teeth. I turned my attention back to the road ahead, pushing myself to run faster. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Every breath was a struggle, my lungs burning with the effort. Eventually I found an old cabin, probably left behind by one of the loggers years ago. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me. The cabin was old, falling apart in places, but it was sturdy enough. I barricaded the door with a chair and a few pieces of broken furniture, then crouched down in the corner, listening. For a while there was nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the creaking of the old wood. Then it came. I heard it outside, moving around the cabin, sniffing the air like it was trying to find a way in. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. The wall shook as it scratched at the door, testing the strength of the wood. I searched frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. But there was nothing. I wasn't armed. We're not supposed to carry guns when we're out here. This was supposed to be a safe area. Safe. What a joke. It stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it had given up. But then the door exploded inward, sending splinters flying across the room. The creature barreled in, its massive form filling the doorway. Its eyes locked onto me, and I felt a terror unlike anything I had ever known. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, an old fire poker, and swung it at the creature as it charged at me. The poker connected with its shoulder, but it didn't seem to care. It barreled into me, knocking me to the ground, its teeth snapping inches from my face. I could feel its hot, rancid breath on my skin as it tried to bite down on me. Its claws dug into my shoulders, pinning me to the floor. I struggled, trying to push it off, but it was too strong. Its weight was crushing, making it hard to breathe. Somehow, in a moment of desperate strength, I managed to get my feet under its belly and kick hard. The creature grunted, its grip loosening just enough for me to roll out from under it. I scrambled to my feet, still clutching the fire poker. The creature turned to face me, its eyes blazing with a primal hunger. It lunged again, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped, swinging the poker with all my might. It caught the creature on the side of the head, sending it staggering sideways. But it recovered quickly, far too quickly for something that had just taken a blow that would have felled a normal animal. It shook its head, as if clearing its vision, and then fixed its gaze on me once more. I knew I couldn't win this fight. The creature was too big, too strong, too resilient. My only hope was to escape. I feinted to the left, then dashed to the right, making for the shattered remains of the door. The creature roared, the sound shaking the walls of the cabin. It leapt after me, its claws tearing gouges in the wooden floor. I dove through the opening, feeling its jaws snap shut just inches from my leg. I hit the ground outside and rolled, coming up running. The road was just a blur as I sprinted, not caring where I was going. Behind me I could hear the creature crashing through the cabin, its roars of frustration echoing through the trees. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, until my legs were numb and heavy. I ran until I couldn't hear the creature anymore, until the only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the door, startling the other rangers inside. They took one look at me, at my torn and bloody clothes, at the wild look in my eyes, and knew something was wrong. I tried to explain, my words coming out in a jumble. I told them about Pete, about the campsite, about the creature. They listened, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was crazy, that the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. But they couldn't ignore the evidence. They found Pete's remains scattered in the woods, along with those of the missing hikers. And the cabin? It was in shambles, just like I said. The door torn off its hinges, claw marks scoring the walls. The rangers organized a search party, combing the woods for any sign of the creature. But they found nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, just like Pete had. They brought in experts, cryptozoologists and biologists, to examine the evidence. They took casts of the footprints, analyzed the claw marks on the trees and the cabin, but none of them could provide a satisfactory explanation for what I had seen. Some suggested a bear, perhaps one suffering from a rare genetic mutation that caused its unusual size and appearance. Others pointed to the local legends, stories of creatures that lurked in the deep woods, waiting to prey on unsuspecting travelers. But I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a legend. It was real, and it was still out there. The rangers closed off the area, posting warnings for hikers to stay away. They increased patrols, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature, or at least to prevent any more disappearances. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding, something ancient and primal, something that had existed long before we had ever set foot in these woods. I threw myself into research, digging through old records and newspaper archives, looking for any mention of similar creatures or unexplained disappearances in the area. And I found them, scattered reports dating back decades, even centuries. There were stories of hunters who ventured into the woods and never returned, of lonely cabins found torn apart, their occupants missing without a trace. There were even old Native American legends, tales of a creature they called the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that could possess humans and turn them into cannibalistic monsters. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I had encountered was not an animal, but something else entirely, something supernatural, something evil. But my superiors didn't want to hear it. They were content to blame a rogue bear, to sweep the whole incident under the rug. They didn't want to deal with the implications of what I was suggesting, the idea that there might be things in the world that defied explanation. I couldn't let it go. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, saw the hunger in its eyes, felt its hot breath on my face. I knew it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. So I made a decision. If no one else was going to hunt this thing, then I would. I started spending all my free time in the woods, tracking, searching for any sign of the creature. I became obsessed, my life consumed by the hunt. My colleagues thought I was losing it. They told me to take a break, to get some help, but I couldn't stop, not until I found it, not until I made sure it could never hurt anyone again. Weeks turned into months, and still, I searched. I became a ghost in the forest, a shadow moving among the trees. I learned to read the signs, to see the subtle disturbances that marked the creature's passing. But it was always one step ahead of me, always just out of reach. It was as if it knew I was coming, as if it could sense my presence. I began to wonder if I was the one being hunted, if the creature was toying with me, leading me deeper and deeper into the wilderness. There were times when I swore I could feel its eyes on me, could hear its breath in the rustling of the leaves, but I couldn't give up. Not after what I had seen, not after what it had done to Pete. I owed it to him, to all the others who had disappeared over the years. As the seasons changed and the years rolled by, I became a fixture in the town near the forest. The locals knew me as the crazy ranger, the one who was always rambling on about monsters in the woods. They avoided me, whispered about me behind my back. But I didn't care. I had a mission, a purpose, and I would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. It was on a cold autumn night, 5 years to the day since my encounter with the creature, that I finally got my chance. I was deep in the woods, following a trail that I had discovered a few days earlier. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I knew it was the creature's. The moon was full, casting an eerie light through the trees. The forest was silent, save for the crunching of leaves beneath my feet. I moved slowly, my senses heightened, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it, a shadow moving through the trees ahead of me. It was massive, its form blending with the darkness. But I knew it was the creature. I could feel it in my bones. I readied my weapon, a high-powered rifle that I had procured specifically for this moment. I had spent countless hours practicing with it, honing my skills until I could shoot with deadly accuracy. I crept closer, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. The creature was moving, its gait slow and lumbering. It seemed unaware of my presence, focused on something else entirely. I took aim, my finger resting on the trigger. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I would finally end this nightmare. But as I was about to pull the trigger, the creature stopped. It raised its head, sniffing the air, and then slowly it turned, its eyes glowing in the moonlight, locked onto mine. In that moment I felt a fear unlike anything I had ever known. It was primal, visceral, the kind of fear that our ancestors must have felt when confronted with the monsters of their own myths and legends. The creature roared, the sound echoing through the forest. It charged, covering the distance between us in a matter of seconds. I fired, the rifle bucking in my hands, but the creature didn't even flinch. It was on me before I could react, its claws tearing into my flesh, its teeth snapping at my face. I fought back with everything I had, but it was useless. The creature was too strong, too fast. I felt my consciousness slipping away, my vision darkening at the edges. This was it. This was how I was going to die, torn apart by a monster in the middle of the woods, just like Pete, just like all the others. But as I slipped into oblivion, I swore I heard something, a voice whispering in my ear. It was ancient, powerful, filled with a malevolence that chilled me to my core. "You are mine now," it said, "forever." I woke up in a hospital bed, my body wrapped in bandages, my mind fuzzy with painkillers. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by too many long nights in the woods. But then I saw the scars, the deep gouges in my flesh that could only have been made by the creature's claws. It had been real, all of it. The rangers had found me, unconscious and bleeding, just a few hundred yards from where I had encountered the creature. They said it was a miracle I was alive, that I should have bled out long before they got to me. But I knew it wasn't a miracle. The creature had let me live. It had marked me, claimed me as its own. I tried to tell them, tried to make them understand, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to blood loss, to the trauma of the attack. They told me I needed to rest, to heal, but I couldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature. I heard its voice whispering in my ear. It was calling to me, beckoning me back into the woods. I knew I had to go back. I had to finish what I started. I had to kill the creature or die trying. So I left the hospital, left the town, left everything behind. I ventured back into the woods, armed with nothing but my wits and my determination. I tracked the creature for days, following its trail deeper and deeper into the wilderness. I barely slept, barely ate. My whole existence was focused on the hunt. And then, finally, I found it. It was waiting for me in a clearing, its form silhouetted against the rising moon. It looked different somehow, larger, more twisted, as if it had grown in power since our last encounter. I raised my rifle, my hand shaking. This was the end. One way or another it ended here. The creature roared, the sound shaking the earth beneath my feet. It charged, its eyes blazing with a hatred that seemed almost human. I fired, again and again, emptying the rifle into the creature's hide. But it kept coming, unfazed by the bullets tearing through its flesh. It slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. I felt its claws sink into my shoulders, felt its hot breath on my face. This was it. This was the end. But as I lay there waiting for the killing blow, something strange happened. The creature paused, its grip on me loosening. It looked down at me, and for a moment I swore I saw something in its eyes, something like recognition, like understanding. And then it spoke. Its voice was like thunder, like the cracking of glaciers. "You are brave, human," it said, "braver than most, but you cannot defeat me. I am eternal. I am the shadow in the woods, the hunger in the dark." I stared up at the creature, my mind reeling. This was impossible. Creatures like this didn't exist, couldn't exist. But here it was, speaking to me, its words echoing inside my head. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. The creature laughed, the sound like the snapping of bone. "I am the Wendigo," it said. "I am the spirit of the hunt, the embodiment of the wild, and you, human, are my prey." It leaned down, its face inches from mine. "But I will not kill you, not yet. You have proven yourself worthy, worthy of the hunt, worthy of the kill." It released me, stepping back into the shadows. "Run, human, run, and know that I will always be behind you, always watching, always waiting. You are mine now, and you always will be." And with that, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been. I lay there for a long time, my body aching, my mind spinning. I knew I should go back, should warn the others, should tell them what I had seen, but I couldn't, because deep down in a part of me that I hardly recognized, I knew the Wendigo was right. I was its now, its to hunt, its to kill. And so I ran. I ran deep into the woods, leaving my old life behind. I became a creature of the wild, a shadow among the trees. I hunt now just as the Wendigo hunts. I stalk the unwary, the lost, the helpless. I am the monster in the dark, the whisper in the night. And sometimes in the stillness of the forest I hear its voice calling to me, reminding me of what I am, of what I will always be. The hunter, the hunted, the Wendigo's own. My name is John Abernathy. I'm 63 years old, and for the past 25 years I've worked as a park ranger across the rugged wilderness areas of the American Midwest and Pacific Northwest. It's a lonely, often thankless job, but the solitude suits me. I've never been much of a people person. I grew up in the small factory town of Muncie, Indiana. My dad worked at the local auto parts plant while Mom stayed home to raise me and my 2 younger sisters. We didn't have much, but we got by. I was a quiet, bookish kid who loved getting lost in stories about faraway places and adventures. The confines of our little Midwestern town always felt stifling to me. After high school, I tried my hand at college, but it never really took. I bounced around between odd jobs for a while, unsure of my path in life. That's when I first started venturing out into the expansive state forests and parks within driving distance, places like Turkey Run and Shades in Indiana, Hocking Hills in Ohio. Amidst those towering trees and craggy ravines, I felt a deep sense of peace and belonging that had always eluded me before. So at age 38, I made a decision. I would become a park ranger. I had no formal background in forestry or ecology, but I was in good physical shape, and I knew my way around the woods. I applied for seasonal positions anywhere that would take me. My first post was at Hartwick Pine State Park in Michigan. Housing was provided in rustic cabins and the pay was meager, but I didn't care. I was finally where I belonged. That was the beginning of my rangering career that would span a quarter century and take me to some of the most beautiful, unforgiving terrain this country has to offer. From the old-growth forests of Oregon's Cascade Mountains to the laurel-choked hollows of western Pennsylvania, to the foggy spruce bogs of northern Wisconsin, I immersed myself in the untamed glory of the land. But I've learned that there are things lurking in the ancient places of this world, things that defy explanation, and my encounters with these darker elements of the wilderness have left me a changed man. It began in the great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. I had transferred there in the fall for what I thought would be a peaceful stint before the heavy snows arrived. My cabin was nestled in an isolated corner of the park, surrounded by meadows that gave way to dense strands of red spruce and Fraser fir. I spent my days patrolling trails, making small talk with hikers, and watching the mountains slowly shift from green to gold. But as the leaves fell and the days grew shorter, a strange unease crept over me, as if the forest itself knew a secret that it wasn't willing to share. The night winds whispered through the eaves, and I swore I could hear voices on the edge of comprehension. Shadows seemed to shift and dart at the corners of my vision. I took to patrolling with my rifle slung over my shoulder, though I couldn't say what I thought I was protecting myself from. It all came to a head on a crisp autumn evening in late October. I was chopping wood behind the cabin, enjoying the nip in the air and the rhythmic thunk of the axe, when I suddenly got the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I peered into the darkening tree line, my heart beginning to race. That's when I saw it. A pale figure stood motionless between the distant trunks, little more than a ghostly smudge. But I could feel its gaze upon me, an inhuman hunger radiating from its face. I fled into the cabin, bolting the door with shaking hands. I spent a sleepless night with my rifle in my lap, watching the blackness beyond the windows, and listening to the unearthly shrieks and growls that rose from the forest. At dawn's first light, I ventured out to find the ground around the cabin pocked with strange three-toed prints sunk deep in the loam. The size of the track suggested a creature that walked upright, but no animal I knew of left marks like that. I put in for a transfer that very day, and though I've had other run-ins with the unexplainable things that haunt the untamed places, none have ever shaken me quite as deeply as my time in the Smokies. It's as if I stepped beyond the veil for a moment, catching a glimpse of the primitive, primal forces that stir beneath the surface of the world we think we know. Forces that have stalked the shadowed corners of this land long before man ever laid claim to it, and will continue to do so long after we're gone. I just pray I never cross their path again. I've never been superstitious by nature. Growing up, I had little patience for folktales and urban legends. I was a practitioner of common sense, my worldview defined by what I could see and touch and verify. But a lifetime spent in deep wilderness has a way of changing your perception. Out there, away from the comforting logic of civilization, different rules seem to apply. The land has a will and memory all its own, and there are things that defy rational explanation. I first began to understand this during my early days as a ranger in Wisconsin's Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. I was tasked with manning a remote fire lookout tower, living in isolation atop a 100-foot steel structure that swayed and groaned with every gust of wind. From my perch, I had a bird's-eye view of the forest sprawling out to the horizon in every direction, an undulating sea of maple, oak, and hemlock that stretched as far as the eye could see. During the day, I would scan for any telltale plumes of smoke rising from the canopy, but it was the nights that I remember most vividly. Up there, with only the stars and the susurrus of the breeze for company, I felt at times like the last man on earth. The darkness pressed in from all sides, so thick it felt almost tangible. And it was then, in that preternatural stillness, that I began to hear the noises. At first I dismissed them as the nightly music of the forest, the hooting of distant owls, the scurrying of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. But as the weeks wore on, I came to recognize a strange cadence woven into the familiar sounds, a sort of rhythmic pulsing, like some tremendous heart beating deep beneath the earth. And overlaying it all, just at the edge of audible perception, what sounded like sibilant whispers in a language I could not begin to fathom. Sleep became increasingly difficult. I'd jolt awake in the darkest hours of the night, my skin crawling with the unshakable feeling of an alien presence watching from the shadows. Several times I could have sworn I glimpsed a phosphorescent sheen, like the cold light of a fungal growth, wavering between the distant tree trunks. There was one night in particular that still haunts my dreams. I was roused from my fitful slumber by a skittering noise on the steps leading up to the trapdoor of my cabin, the unmistakable sound of something climbing towards me with terrible purpose. My heart pounding, I fumbled for my flashlight and revolver, but when I flung open the hatch, the stairs descended into impenetrable blackness, the beam from my light seeming to strain against the gloom. I caught a fleeting impression of damp, glistening foliage and knotted rope-like vines writhing up out of the darkness, and then something pale and fungoid disappearing over the edge of the platform. I slammed the hatch and wedged a chair beneath the handle, spending the remainder of the night in a state of panicked vigilance. At daybreak, I radioed the district office and demanded an immediate transfer, fabricating an illness in my family that required my urgent presence. I couldn't bring myself to report what I had seen. I knew how it would sound to rational ears, but I never quite shook the sense that I had brushed against something in those remote Wisconsin woods, something primordial and hungry that had marked me with its baleful attention. Even now, decades later, I sometimes awaken in the night with the phantom sensation of a chthonic drumbeat pulsing in my bones and the ghostly echo of those whispering voices at the back of my skull. Some places, I've learned, were never meant for us. There are things out there in the untrammeled corners of this land that we were never meant to behold. You can go your whole life never running across them, but once you do, you're never quite the same. I've always been drawn to high and lonesome places. There's a purity to be found in the thin air and knife-edged peaks, a clarity that strips away all pretense and illusion. In the mountains, things are reduced to their stark, elemental reality. So it was with eagerness that I took a posting as a backcountry ranger in Oregon's Cascade Range in the late autumn of '87. The climbing season had wound down, and the tourists had largely cleared out. I had the wilderness to myself, just the way I liked it. My patrol area encompassed the Mount Hood National Forest, a sprawling expanse of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and mountain meadows. I spent my days roving the trails, making notes on flora and fauna, and ensuring the strict leave-no-trace principles were being adhered to by the few hardy hikers still venturing out. As the days shortened and the snows began to fly, I fell into a sort of contented rhythm. There was a satisfying simplicity to my existence, rising with the sun, making my rounds, then returning to my tiny patrol cabin to read by lamplight and listen to the wind keening in the eaves. If I was lonely, I didn't acknowledge it, but as November tightened its grip, I began to notice a subtle change in the atmosphere of the forest. A brooding stillness seemed to descend, the silence between gusts ringing like a held breath. The snowfalls muffled all sound, casting the land in a deathly, eyeless white that played tricks on the mind. I started to get the distinct sense that I was not as alone out there as I had thought. More than once I returned to my cabin to find strange tracks in the freshly fallen powder surrounding the structure. Prints that seemed to simply begin at the tree line, with no discernible origin trail, then disappear again a dozen yards from my door. They were vaguely human in shape and gait, but where the toes should have splayed, there were only smooth, tapering whorls, as if made by something wearing seamless skins over its feet. Then there were the trees. As I snowshoed through the drifts, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had somehow closed in around me, ancient trunks leaning together like conspiratorial giants, and there was a watchfulness to them that I had never sensed before, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were scrutinizing my every move. Things came to an unsettling climax on a storm-bound evening in early December. I was holed up in my cabin, stoking a crackling blaze in the small pot-bellied stove and nursing a mug of reconstituted coffee. The wind howled like a lost soul, rattling the shutters and sending phantasmal fingers of snow skittering across the roof. I couldn't say what made me set down my tin cup and rise to peer out the ice-limbed window. But as I did, every hair on my nape bristled with inexplicable terror. There, in the swirling white, a figure appeared to be standing at the edge of the clearing, as still and silent as the blizzard itself. It was little more than a dark, blurred silhouette, but I could feel the weight of its regard like a physical pressure, pushing in at me from the storm. I stumbled back from the frosty pane, a wordless shout catching in my throat. In the space of a blink, the shape had vanished, but it had imparted the unshakable conviction that whatever domain I thought I held out there in the high country, I was little more than a guest, and not necessarily a welcome one. I spent a largely sleepless night huddled by the stove, my rifle close at hand. And though I finished out my rotation without further incident, I was oddly relieved to put the Cascades behind me come spring. There's an uncanny awareness to the very oldest and wildest places, an ancient animus that crouches and watches from the wayless glens and mist-webbed glades. And while we may traverse those hoary domains with all our modern contrivances and assurances, it's an unwise man who forgets, even for an instant, that out there he is little more than an interloper in a far older world. It was the fall of 1999 when I found myself deputized as a ranger in the Allegheny National Forest of northwestern Pennsylvania. At over 500,000 acres, it's the state's largest swath of federally protected woodland, sprawling across a plateau laced with creeks, ravines, and bogs that haven't changed much since the first European settlers arrived. I'd been through my share of eerie encounters in various wildernesses by that point, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited in the depths of the Alleghenies. There's an uncanniness to those woods, a brooding sense of something ancient and not quite right. The very air feels thick with secrets, like an unresolved chord hanging in the silence. Maybe it's the history of the place. The forest sits at the northern edge of Appalachia, a region steeped in hardship and strange folklore. You can practically feel the weight of all those long and lonely generations out there, toiling in the hills and hollows. It's a haunted country. But what I encountered was more than just the residue of human suffering. There was a malevolence to it, an alien hostility that seemed woven into the very fabric of the land itself. It started with small things, inexplicable cold spots that would envelop me as I hiked the trails, sending goosebumps marching down my arms even on the sultriest summer days. Fleeting glimpses of pale, oddly elongated shapes flickering between the oaks and hemlocks. The unshakable feeling of being watched and even stalked by an unseen presence. But the incident that finally sent me over the edge unfolded on a misty morning near the tail end of October. I was patrolling a remote stretch of trail that wound along a series of steep ravines and gaunt outcroppings known locally as the Hells. Even by midday, very little light penetrated the choked canopy down there. It was perpetually twilit, cool and dank and vaguely menacing. I had just rounded a bend when an ungodly shriek split the air directly behind me. I spun around, my hand dropping to the butt of my service pistol, and every drop of blood turned to ice water in my veins. Crouched not a dozen feet away in the center of the trail was a thing. It resembled a spindly, emaciated human figure, but its proportions were monstrously distorted, the limbs far too long and multi-jointed. Papery, corpse-gray skin was pulled drum-tight over jutting bones, but worst of all was the face, a grotesque, eyeless expanse pocked with irregular holes that quivered spasmodically as if gulping for air. The abomination bared needle-like teeth in a rictus grin, then skittered towards me on all fours with hideous speed. Blind, gut-wrenching panic seized me. I turned and ran, hurtling over deadfalls and crashing through underbrush in a mad dash to put distance between myself and that ghastly apparition. By the time I reached the trailhead, my lungs were bursting and my mind was reeling. I could not process what I had just seen. I radioed the district office, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form the words, and requested immediate backup. But when a crew arrived to scour the area, they found no trace of the creature, only my own frenzied tracks in the loam. I never hiked that path again, and I kept a wary eye on the shadowed tree line for the remainder of my time in the Alleghenies, a new and visceral dread knotting my gut whenever I glimpsed the woods deepen into older, quieter reaches. I still don't know quite what to make of what I saw out there. A previously undiscovered species, some sort of atavistic mutant spewed up from the bowels of the ancient mountains, or something stranger still, a being that had no place in our consensus reality. I'm not sure I want to know, but I am certain of one thing. For all our dominion and sprawl, there remain pockets in this world where humans are alien trespassers, and you venture into them at your own peril. There's a certain type of individual drawn to the rangering life, quiet, self-reliant, content with solitude. We're a breed apart, at home in the hinterlands and untamed places. But even among such a far-flung fraternity, there are those of us who have stared into the true wilderness and caught a glimpse of something staring back. I met one such man during a shared posting in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the early 2000s. Abe Harrington was his name, a fellow lifer who had been wearing the badge since before I was born. He was a gruff, taciturn old bird, all sinew and gristle with a permanently weathered squint. But beneath the rough-hewn exterior I sensed a kindred spirit. We had just finished a long day clearing blowdowns on the escarpment trail, and were bunking down in one of the backcountry lean-tos when Abe suddenly spoke up from his bedroll. "You ever see anything out there you can't explain?" he asked, his voice a low rasp in the firelit darkness. "Anything that ain't natural?" I was quiet for a long moment, weighing my words. "Maybe," I allowed at last. "Why do you ask?" Abe shifted, the nylon of his bag rustling. His face was gaunt and lined in the shifting light, his eyes distant. "Because I reckon you and I, we're two of a rare breed, men who've walked the lonesome places and come back changed by 'em." He proceeded to tell me about his own uncanny encounter decades prior, as a young ranger patrolling the Siskiyou Mountains of Oregon. He spoke of a moonless night when he found himself stalked through the firs and redwoods by something pale and twisted, a thing that gibbered in the darkness and left three-toed tracks sunk inches deep in the soft forest loam. Abe's account was eerily similar to my own experiences, the sense of something primal and fiercely territorial dogging his steps, a presence that seemed to emanate a seething hatred for his intrusion into its lightless domain. He looked at me long and hard across the guttering flames. "There's things out there in the old places," he said quietly, "things that got no use for the likes of us. But there's men like you and me. We catch a glimpse beyond the veil, whether we want to or not." Abe left the service the following spring. I heard he moved to New Mexico, took up prospecting in the Gila wilderness. Anything to avoid the deep woods, I suppose. I can't say I blame him. That conversation stuck with me through the remainder of my own career. It was a strange sort of consolation, knowing there were others out there who had brushed against the same unnameable entities that stalked the periphery of my own experiences. It made me feel a little less alone, a little less unmoored from the rational world. But it was also a grim reminder that for all our modern certainties, there are still pockets of primal wilderness out there that belong to older, darker forces. Places where man is little more than an intruder, tolerated for a time but never truly welcome. And God help any poor soul who lingers too long in their shadow. The events I've recounted so far may paint the life of a ranger as one of unrelenting gloom and horror. But the truth is, for every unsettling incident, there were 100 moments of heart-swelling beauty and wonder. I've watched the sun rise over misty valleys, the first slanting rays setting dew-jeweled spiderwebs alight like constellations of earthbound stars. I've walked in cathedral quiet beneath towering sequoias and listened to the staccato drum of a pileated woodpecker high in the canopy. I've glimpsed the liquid silver flash of a leaping salmon and cradled a newly hatched monarch butterfly in the cup of my palm. These are the memories I hold dear, the ones that sustain me through the dark times and the lonely years. For the wilderness is many things, haunting, inhospitable, even hostile, but it is also a place of staggering, unsubdued beauty, and I consider myself unspeakably lucky to have made my life in its midst. There was one particular location that captured my heart like no other, the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, a shimmering archipelago set like a jeweled necklace in the cold, clear waters of Lake Superior. I was stationed there in the mid-90s and quickly came to regard it as a sort of spiritual touchstone, a place that restored my equilibrium and reaffirmed my love for the untamed land. I would spend my off days kayaking between the craggy, pine-tufted isles, nosing into hidden sea caves where the aquamarine water shone with an unearthly purity. Sometimes I simply beached my craft and wandered barefoot along the sandy shores, collecting wave-polished stones and sun-bleached driftwood. One evening near the autumn equinox, I was paddling back to the mainland as the sinking sun set the horizon aflame. The lake was a sheet of molten gold, the island's inky cutouts against the coloratura sky. As I drifted, drunk on the sheer beauty of the moment, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something was coursing over the burnished surface of the water, leaving a V-shaped wake, but not like any watercraft I had ever seen. It appeared to be a sinuous, serpentine form, gliding with boneless, undulating grace just beneath the mirrored surface. As it passed no more than an oar's length from my kayak, I caught an impression of mottled sea-green hide dappled with strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change even as I watched. And then, for one heart-stopping instant, a colossal eye rolled up to meet my gaze, a molten amber orb easily the size of a dinner plate, replete with ancient alien intelligence. The moment hung suspended, a fragile filament stretching between worlds, and then the thing slipped beneath the burnished waves with scarcely a ripple, leaving me alone with the hammering of my pulse and the vast, inscrutable expanse of the inland sea. In the years since, I've often puzzled over the meaning of that extraordinary sighting. Was it some variety of long-fabled lake monster, a cousin to Loch Ness's famed denizen, a glimpse of a relic species surviving unsuspected since the primordial depths of time and Superior's frigid depths? Or something stranger still, an entity not quite of our reality at all? I have no answers, but I do know that in that instant I touched the infinite mystery at the heart of the wild, and the awe of it has never left me. Even now, in my twilight years, I find myself drawn back to Superior's stark and stony shores, hoping for another glimpse of the sublime. For while the unknown may be shot through with strangeness and even terror, it is also limned with a beauty and wonder beyond reckoning. And that perhaps is what called me to this life in the first place, the chance to walk in the shadows between the rational and the supernal, and to bear witness to all the savage glory of the untamed earth. As I look back on my long career in the wild places, I'm struck by how much has changed, and how much has not. The gear has certainly evolved, all Gore-Tex and carbon fiber where once it was wool and leather, and the folks one meets out on the trails seem so much younger than I remember being, their faces fresh and unlined, their eyes still alight with the promise of adventure. But the land itself, in all its moods and weathers, remains a constant. There are still mornings when I catch the scent of pines on the wind or hear the wild cry of a loon across the water, and I am a young man again, setting out with all the hope and hunger of my untested years. I think that's why even in retirement I find myself drawn back out into the backcountry at every opportunity. There's a sense of belonging there, a rightness that I've found nowhere else. In the cities and towns, I'm a ghost, a relic out of time. But in the wilderness, I am part of a grander, more elemental story. Perhaps that's also why those of us who have glimpsed the stranger side of nature feel so compelled to bear witness, even if only to each other. In a world increasingly detached from its own origins, we serve as a living reminder that there are still uncharted territories out beyond the campfire's glow, and that maybe, just maybe, it's better that some of them remain that way. I am an old man now, my joints stiff and my eyes clouded by the slow cataracts of age. But I still get out there when I can, hobbling along the trails with my walking stick, breathing in the loamy decay of the forest floor. I may not range as far or as fast as I once did, but I like to think I notice more now, as if some veil has been pulled aside. Like last autumn, when I was shuffling through a stand of old-growth hemlocks in the Porcupine Mountains of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The light slanted down in smoky shafts, dappling the mossy boles and making the bronze needles glow like stained glass. I had just paused to examine a clutch of velvety amanita mushrooms when I heard it, a distant flute-like piping, eerie and achingly beautiful in the hush. It seemed to be coming from a nearby glen, a ferny hollow cupped between two granite outcrops, and though every rational instinct urged me to keep walking, I found myself drawn towards that unearthly music as if beckoned. What I saw in that sun-drenched glade will haunt me until the end of my days. A circle of small, slender figures no more than 3 feet in height, dancing with liquid, impossible grace on cloven hooves. Their bodies were dappled with mottled patterns of light and shadow, their features strangely elongated, as if some sly intelligence had attempted to sculpt the human form, but not quite grasped the proportions. They capered and spun in a frenzied, ecstatic ring, all to the accompaniment of that fey piping anthem. Then one turned to look at me, large and long and full in the eye, and I remembered myself. I lurched backwards, nearly losing my footing in my haste to quit the place, and as I did, I swear I heard a sound like silvery laughter echoing from the rocks behind me. It was a vision out of a fairy tale, a glimpse beyond the veil into the preternatural realm of folklore and myth. And though a part of me still thrills at the memory, I am also unsettled by it in a way I find hard to express. Because if such beings truly share this world with us, what other marvels and horrors might await, crouched unseen in the remaining untamed nooks and crannies of this ancient earth? It's a question that fills me with equal parts wonder and dread, but I suppose that's always been the double-edged gift of the wild places, the sublime beauty and the ineffable mystery, the heart-stopping awe and the scalp-prickling fear. To spend one's life in the wilderness is to embrace all of it, the light and the shadow, knowing that to deny either would be to diminish the whole. And so I go on walking the old trails, my eyes turned ever towards the horizon, my heart open to whatever strange wonders and uncanny encounters may yet lie in wait. For as long as I draw breath, I will bear witness to the savage glory of this untrammeled earth, even if sometimes what stares back is not altogether human. Here at the tail end of a life spent largely out of doors, I find my thoughts turning more and more to the strangeness I've encountered along the way, the seemingly inexplicable things glimpsed from the corner of an eye, the prickling of hackles in response to some unseen presence, the incidents that defy all rational explanation. A younger me would have dismissed such experiences as tricks of light and fatigue, the mind's attempt to impose pattern on the chaotic face of the wild. But with the long perspective of years, I find myself wondering if perhaps the opposite is true. If perhaps it's our consensual reality that is the illusion, a thin and flimsy veil laid over the churning architecture of a much vaster and more terrifying universe. Because the truth is, the natural world as we conceive it is little more than a human conceit, a way of filtering the infinite down to a manageable scale. In our day-to-day lives, we fool ourselves that we have tamed the wilderness, bent it to our will, and made it knowable. But all it takes is one step off the beaten path to realize how fragile that conceit really is. Out there in the untrammeled places, there are things that do not conform to our tidy taxonomies and cozy certitudes. Ancient pre-human intelligences that have tenanted this planet since long before our species drew its first breath. Intrusions from adjacent realities and alien dimensions whose very existence threatens to shatter our sanity. Trickster entities and protean spirits that dance in the spaces between, working ineffable agendas that intersect with our own in ways we cannot begin to fathom. I have always been a practical man, with little patience for metaphysical speculation, but I have seen too much in my long sojourn through the wilderness to dismiss the uncanny out of hand, and I have begun to suspect that those of us who are called to spend our lives in the wild are more than mere rangers and resource managers. In a sense, we are wardens on the threshold, standing guard over the porous places where the familiar and the unfathomable bleed together. It is a lonely vigil, set as it is on the fringes of human understanding, but it is a necessary one, because for all our hubris we remain but clumsy interlopers in a world that is infinitely older, stranger, and more wondrous than we can possibly imagine. A world that will go on turning long after the last of us has crumbled to dust, our civilizations and certainties all laid waste by the implacable passage of time. The only question is whether we have the humility to recognize our true place in that incomprehensible vastness, or if, like so many before us, we will blunder on in ignorance until we are swept away by forces beyond our reckoning. For myself, as I sit here in the gathering twilight and listen to the wind gossiping in the eaves, I find a curious peace in embracing the unknown, in accepting that for all my long years and countless footfalls, I have barely begun to plumb the mysteries of this ancient, unfathomable earth. The wilderness keeps its secrets close and always will. But if there's one thing I have learned in my decades walking the wild places, it is this. The biggest mistake a man can make is believing he has seen everything there is to see, because the truth is, he hasn't even scratched the surface. There are marvels and horrors out there beyond all imagining, crouched and waiting in the shadowed hollows of this turning world. And if he's very lucky, or perhaps very unlucky, he might just live long enough to encounter them. But either way, the land will go on, timeless and inscrutable, and vastly, achingly alive. And in the end, that may be the only certainty we can cling to. My name is Ethan Novak. I'm 28 years old and I live in a small cabin in the remote wilderness of Oregon's Willamette National Forest where I work as a park ranger. It's a solitary life patrolling these vast swaths of dense woods, but I've always been drawn to nature. Hiking, camping, exploring the outdoors. Those are the things that make me feel alive. I took this job 3 years ago when I was desperate for work. I had bounced around between seasonal gigs, leading tours in Michigan, manning fire lookouts in Pennsylvania, doing trail maintenance in Wisconsin. But those positions were temporary, and the pay was meager. I needed something steady. That's when I saw the posting for a full-time backcountry ranger position out here in Oregon. I knew it would be isolating and the work would be grueling at times, but the Willamette is breathtakingly beautiful, and I felt an immediate connection to the rugged landscape. I thought I had finally found my calling. The first couple years were incredible. I loved getting to know every corner of the 1.6 million acre forest. Towering Douglas firs, cascading waterfalls, fields of wildflowers that stretched as far as the eye could see. I woke up each day excited to get out and experience the wonders of the wilderness. Sure, there were challenges. I had to help lost hikers find their way, educate careless campers about leave-no-trace principles, keep an eye out for signs of forest fires. But I felt uniquely suited to handle those responsibilities. This was where I belonged. Then, about 6 months ago, things started to change. It was subtle at first. I began to get this unsettling feeling when I was out on patrol, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to spending so much time alone in the woods. Of course, a person's mind might play tricks on them, but the sensation grew stronger and more frequent, and soon I started to notice other peculiar things happening in the forest as well. It started with some odd tree carvings that I spotted in a grove off one of the lesser-used trails. They looked ancient, the symbols and shapes etched deep into the bark. I'd never seen anything like them before. As I studied the markings, a wave of dizziness hit me, and I had to grab onto a branch to keep from collapsing. The queasy feeling passed almost instantly, but it left me shaken. Had the carvings somehow triggered a physical reaction in me? That seemed impossible, and yet I couldn't shake the notion that they were imbued with some sort of dark energy. I tried to put the strange incident out of my mind and focus on my ranger duties, but then the nightmares started. Vivid, visceral dreams of being lost in the woods, disembodied voices whispering in some unknown tongue, the trees closing in around me until I couldn't breathe. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding out of my chest. Sleep became elusive, and the lack of rest only amplified my growing unease. As I hiked the trails, I'd get flashes, almost like waking visions, of phantasmic figures darting between the trees, watching me. When I tried to follow, they would vanish without a trace. A pervasive sense of being followed dogged my every step. But worse than that was the unshakable feeling that the forest itself had come alive in some malevolent way. The shadows took on a physical weight. The wind carried foreboding whispers through the leaves. Even the earth under my feet felt like it was pulsating with a menacing force. Something was very wrong in the Willamette, and somehow I knew it had something to do with me. I've always prided myself on being rational, but the strange incidents kept piling up until I could no longer dismiss them. The carvings, the visions, the change in the forest's atmosphere. I tried to find logical explanations, but kept coming up short. I contacted a few of my old ranger buddies to see if they had ever encountered anything like this in their parks. Jeff, who I worked with in the Smokies, said he once found some creepy stone totems way off trail that gave him a weird vibe. And Sheila, from my tour guide days, claimed she saw the ghostly figure of a Native American warrior while out on a night hike in the UP of Michigan, but nothing that sounded as pervasive and disturbing as what I was experiencing. The lack of sleep from the nightmares was making it hard to think straight. I felt perpetually on edge, jumping at every sound in the woods. My hikes began to take on a frantic quality as I found myself rushing through my patrols, eager to get back to the dubious safety of my cabin. But as soon as I stepped inside, a deep uneasiness would settle over me. It was like I could feel a malignant force pressing against the walls. No matter where I turned, there was no respite from the suffocating dread. Things reached a terrifying climax on a warm evening in late August. I was leading a group of campers to a popular spot by the river when I spotted another one of those disturbing carved trees a few yards off the trail. My pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I tried to keep my composure for the sake of the campers, but as we drew closer to the tree, an overwhelming nausea gripped me. I mumbled an excuse about not feeling well and told the group to go on ahead without me, that I would catch up after taking a short rest. As soon as they were out of sight, I staggered over to the tree to examine the strange markings. The dizziness intensified with each step until I had to drop to my knees in front of the trunk. That's when I noticed there was a dark stain on the bark that I hadn't seen from the trail. With a trembling hand, I reached out to touch the tacky substance. Blood, fresh blood. A twig snapped behind me and I spun around, reaching for the bear spray on my belt. But what I saw emerging from the shadows wasn't any forest creature. It had the basic shape of a man, but it was much too tall, with limbs that looked as gnarled and twisted as the branches around it. Antlers protruded from its skull, dripping with some viscous fluid. And its face, dear God, I don't have the words to describe the horrific sight of that face. I tried to scramble away, but suddenly the roots of the tree were wrapping around my legs, holding me in place. The creature took a lurching step forward, its joints cracking like splintering wood with the movement. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I could only watch in silent terror as it loomed over me, its grotesque features splitting into a macabre grin. A guttural sound emanated from its throat, ancient words that my mind couldn't comprehend. As its clawed hand reached for me, I saw the campers coming back down the trail towards us. I tried to call out a warning, but it was too late. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of their screaming. I awoke to blinding sunlight filtering through the trees and the concerned faces of my campers hovering over me. Groggy and disoriented, it took a minute for the events prior to my collapse to come rushing back. I lurched upright, my head swiveling to find the gnarled tree and the nightmarish creature that had emerged from behind it. But there was no sign of the macabre scene that had played out. I was simply lying on the soft carpet of pine needles a few feet from the trail. The campers asked if I was okay, if I needed any water or food. Still reeling, I managed to croak out that I must have tripped and knocked myself out for a moment. I waved off their offers of assistance and stood on shaky legs, my eyes darting through the surrounding woods. Had it all been some sort of horrific hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by my exhaustion and frayed nerves? I desperately wanted to believe that, but the lingering sense of wrongness that hung over the forest and the deep ache in my bones told me otherwise. I knew I hadn't imagined the unnatural texture of the roots binding my legs, or the foul stench of decay that had emanated from the creature's flesh. I stumbled through the motions of leading the campers to the river and setting up for the night. Mechanically, I built a fire and told some campfire stories, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. As soon as I was able, I retreated to my own small tent and burrowed into my sleeping bag as if the flimsy fabric could shield me from the malevolent forces lurking in the darkness. Sleep was a lost cause. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted face leering at me. The ancient words it had spoken echoed in my mind, even though I didn't understand them. I laid awake until the gray light of dawn seeped through the tent walls. When the campers started to stir, I emerged and brewed some strong coffee. I'd need the jolt of caffeine to get through the hike back out to civilization. On the trek out of the woods, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me flinch. I was hyper-alert, my nerves stretched taut as I scanned the trees for any sign of unnatural movement. By the time we reached the trailhead and I waved goodbye to the campers, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped my keys trying to unlock my truck. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I pulled out onto the highway and left the oppressive forest behind. But it was short-lived. As the miles ticked by, a creeping sense of dread spread through my chest and nested there, a gnawing certainty that whatever dark thing had found me in those woods, it wasn't something I could run from. It had marked me, chosen me for some terrible purpose I didn't yet understand. When I got home, I tried to numb the fear with a few slugs of cheap whiskey, but the alcohol did nothing to dissolve the sour panic on my tongue. I booted up my aging laptop, unsure exactly what I was looking for, but desperate for some kind of answers or context for what was happening to me. I started with a general search for Willamette National Forest legends, but that only turned up a few dubious references to Bigfoot sightings and abandoned gold mines. I tried different keyword combinations: tree carvings, antlered humanoid, ancient forest evil, becoming more and more frustrated as I clicked through the meager results. There had to be something, some scrap of information that could shed light on these terrifying experiences. But the internet, for all its collective knowledge, just didn't seem to hold the key. Around 3 a.m., eyes bleary and head pounding, I finally stumbled across a brief mention in an old anthropological paper about certain northern tribes having stories of forest spirits, some benevolent but many dark and vengeful. There were no specifics, and the author seemed to dismiss the legends as mere cautionary tales, but it was the closest thing I'd found to an explanation so far. I managed to track down a contact email for the professor who'd written the paper. I drafted a message describing my experiences and asking if he knew anything more about these malicious entities that might inhabit the deep woods. My finger hovered over the send button for a long moment. Did I really want to commit these ramblings to the eyes of a stranger? Would he think I was crazy? Or worse, would speaking the words aloud somehow summon more of the evil into my life? In the end, I was just too scared and tired not to take the chance. I hit send and then crawled into my bed, where I lapsed into a fitful sleep plagued by visions of being chased through endless miles of darkened wilderness by a monster wearing the forest as its skin. I awoke from my restless slumber with a throbbing headache. Fragments of my nightmares lingered at the edges of my consciousness. The sensation of rough bark under my palms, ragged breathing hot on the back of my neck, a sibilant voice whispering words I couldn't understand. Shaking off the unsettling images, I stumbled bleary-eyed into the kitchen to start a pot of strong coffee. As I waited for the ancient Mr. Coffee to sputter and steam, I checked my email on my phone. My heart stuttered when I saw a reply from Professor Navarro, the anthropologist I'd contacted in the wee hours of the morning. Part of me had hoped he'd write back with a logical explanation for what I'd experienced. Maybe that there had been some mild hallucinogen in that strange tree sap, and inhaling the fumes had caused vivid delusions. But the tone of his message made it clear this was not going to be a comforting read. I took a fortifying gulp of the scalding coffee and began to read. The professor said that while documented evidence was scarce, many indigenous cultures across North America had ancient oral legends of dark spirits inhabiting the deep wilderness. Often these entities were described as malevolent forces of nature that could take on various forms: an animal, a plant, a humanoid figure composed of forest material. They were believed to act as guardians of their territory and would sometimes target humans who trespassed or violated the sanctity of their domain. The Ojibwe called them Bagwajinini, or wild men. The Hopi spoke of elusive beings known as Masko Sinom, stick men who roamed the desert. For the Yakama and Lumi peoples of the Pacific Northwest, where I was now, there were stories of Tsiatko, forest spirits that could steal a man's senses and lead him astray, driving him to madness. There was even an archaic word for it, Wendigo psychosis, a term early European settlers had used to describe those afflicted by these encounters. Professor Navarro offered no concrete advice on how to combat these entities, if they were indeed real. The legends were frustratingly vague on that front, suggesting that once a forest spirit had targeted someone, that person's fate was as good as sealed. I felt the coffee turn to acid in my gut. Was that to be my destiny then? To be driven into insanity or worse by an ancient, unknowable evil that had marked me for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom? I remembered the dreams that had plagued me for months, the uncanny feeling of being watched in the woods, and the horribly unnatural way the trees themselves had seemed to restrain me during the last encounter. Clearly, whatever was out there wasn't content to simply haunt me from the shadows anymore. The idea that it might find me here in my home made me break out in a cold sweat despite the warm spring morning. I knew what I had to do, even though every cell in my body screamed in protest. I had to go back into the forest. I had to confront this thing head on, try to understand what it wanted from me. It was a thin hope, but maybe if I could find a way to communicate with it, to appease it somehow, I could bargain for my sanity and my life. Running clearly wasn't an option. It would always find me. My only choice was to face the nightmare stalking me and pray I survived the encounter. I sent a hasty email to my supervisor claiming I'd come down with the flu. Then I started throwing supplies in my pack: extra water, energy bars, first aid kit, flares, bear mace. Not that I expected any of that would offer much help against a supernatural threat, but it made me feel slightly less vulnerable. When I picked up my old buck knife to add to the gear, my hands were trembling so badly I nearly sliced my palm open. Get it together, Novak. On my way out of town, I stopped at the sporting goods store and made an impulse buy, a small pistol. The weight of it in my glove compartment was a cold comfort as I turned onto the Forest Service Road. The weathered wooden sign marking the entrance to the Willamette National Forest loomed ahead of me, the words taking on an uncanny sense of finality. I felt like I was crossing the threshold into a hostile foreign land from which I might never return. As I parked in the empty trailhead lot and laced up my boots, a line from that old Tolkien book I'd loved as a kid echoed morbidly in my mind. The way is shut. It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it until the time comes. I could only pray I wouldn't be joining their ranks before this terrible journey reached its end. The forest closed in around me as soon as I left the parking lot, the lush foliage seeming to swallow up the pale spring sunlight. Everything looked ostensibly the same as it always had. Towering pines, chattering jays, the rich scent of sun-warmed earth, but it was all underlaid with an unmistakable aura of menace that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Each step I took along the winding trail brought a fresh wave of dread crashing over me. I paused at a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. I was operating purely on instinct here. It wasn't like the thing had left me any kind of coordinates for a fated meetup. Closing my eyes, I tried to tap into the unnatural connection I felt to this place, to let the sinister thing that had been pulling my strings guide me to it. Almost immediately I felt a tug in my chest, an unseen force yanking me subtly but insistently. Almost immediately I felt a tug in my chest, an unseen force yanking me subtly but insistently to the left. The path in that direction was narrower, more overgrown, clearly not a well-traveled route, which I supposed made sense. I doubted this thing wanted our little tete-a-tete to be interrupted by an errant hiker out for a morning constitutional. The further I went, the thicker the underbrush became, the thorny branches clawing at my clothes as if trying to hold me back. A sudden cacophony of caws made me nearly leap out of my skin, but it was just a murder of crows erupting from a nearby tree. I tried to calm my thundering pulse as I soldiered on deeper into the woods. The air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive with each step, and my legs started to feel like they were wading through quicksand. Just as I was about to collapse from sheer exhaustion, both mental and physical, the wall of vegetation abruptly parted and I stumbled into a small clearing. The moment I crossed the threshold, it was like all the sound had been sucked out of the world, replaced by an eerie, buzzing silence that made my eardrums ache. In the center of the clearing stood a tree, gnarled and ancient-looking, with those same disturbing carvings etched into its trunk that I'd seen before. Only now, in the wan light filtering through the leaves, I could see they weren't just random symbols, but rather formed a vaguely humanoid shape, stick-thin limbs akimbo. A wave of nausea hit me as I stared at the grotesque effigy, and I had to swallow hard against the sudden surge of bile in my throat. This was it, the nexus of the horrific energy that had been hounding me for months. I could feel it emanating from the tree like heat from a blast furnace, sickly and angry. My hand crept towards the pistol tucked into my waistband, sweat-slick fingers wrapping around the grip. A twig snapped behind me and I spun around, ripping the gun from my belt and leveling it with shaking hands at the tree line. My heart seized in my chest as a tall, spindly figure emerged from the shadows, antlers scraping the low-hanging branches. It was the same nightmarish entity I had encountered before, but out here in the stark light of day, it looked even more horrific. Its emaciated body was a patchwork of bark and lichen and rotting leaves, as if the forest itself was a skin it could don or discard at will. "What do you want from me?" I croaked out, hating how small and terrified my voice sounded in the choked stillness of the clearing. The thing tilted its head, considering me with eyes that gleamed like black beetles. When it spoke, its voice was the groan of trees twisting in the wind, the skitter of 1,000 tiny insect feet. "You are the one who came seeking me, human, drawn like a moth to the flame, unable to resist the call." I shook my head desperately, even as some part of me knew the words to be true. "No, I don't. I never wanted this. I don't understand what's happening to me." The creature moved with an uncanny grace, circling me slowly. I pivoted to keep my gun and eyes trained on it, for all the good it would likely do. You were marked from the moment you first set foot in my domain. I saw your true nature, the darkness in your heart that called out to my own. Tears of frustration and terror burned my eyes. You're wrong, there's no darkness in me. I'm not like you, I'm human, it hissed disdainfully. Your kind are all the same, blundering through the world, blind to the forces you disrupt, the balance you upend. But you, Ethan Novak, something in you resonated with the deep magic of these woods. Why else do you think I chose you? I had no response to that, my mind still reeling from its implication that I was somehow different, attuned to whatever vile frequency it put out. The creature spread its gnarly arms wide. I have walked this earth since long before your kind crawled from the primordial muck. I am the shadow in the trees, the whisper in the leaves, and I will endure long after your noisy species has burned itself out. None may enter my forest without leave. So what? I snarled, anger briefly overtaking my fear. You're some kind of self-appointed protector of the wilderness, punishing the wicked humans who dare to trespass in your domain. Something like that, it said with a laugh like snapping twigs. Do you think these woods need your roads, your trails, your trash? I maintain the old ways, remind your kind of the truly wild places that were here first and will be long after. I gaped at it, incredulous despite the dread still twisting my guts. So you torment innocent people, drive them mad or worse, just because they wanted to go for a hike. That's seriously fucked up. In a blink, the creature was looming over me, its fetid breath hot on my face. My finger tightened reflexively on the trigger of my gun, but I didn't pull it. Not yet. You still do not understand, little sapling, it growled. This forest is far older and more powerful than you can conceive. There is a price for entering it, for presuming to know its secrets. You have been chosen to pay that price. Yeah, I said through clenched teeth. And what happens if I refuse this dubious honor? It smiled, and the twisted sight almost made me piss myself. Then perhaps I'll extend the invitation to those campers you're so fond of leading through my woods. Children's minds are so delightfully easy to break. Red hazed the edges of my vision. It was one thing for this bastard to threaten me, but innocents, kids? Oh, hell no. My finger started to tighten on the trigger again as I prepared to pump this arboreal asshole full of lead, even if it was futile. But in the space of a breath, a strange calm washed over me, like sinking into dark, still water. I felt my limbs go loose, my arm lowering as if of its own accord. The tree creature smiled knowingly as it watched the fight drain out of me. Good boy, it purred. You begin to understand your place. Walk with me now and I will show you the true nature of the wild. As if in a dream, I let the gun fall from my numb fingers and took a shuffling step forward. The last rational corner of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but it was rapidly drowned out by a seductive whisper promising secrets, promising power, promising a belonging I had never known. The creature turned and melted soundlessly into the underbrush. After a final moment of resistance, I felt my feet carrying me after it, off the trail and into the darkest heart of the forest, to an unknowable fate. The way was shut behind me. Time lost all meaning as I followed the creature deeper into the wilderness. Minutes, hours, days, they blurred together in a haze of green and shadow and the susurrus of the leaves. The forest seemed to shift around us, trees vanishing or suddenly appearing in my peripheral vision. Everything was mist and illusion, the only solid thing the spindly figure shambling ahead of me on its twisted path. We didn't speak. The creature seemed content to let the uncanny silence spin out between us, broken only by the occasional animal cry that sounded far too human for comfort. Nor did we seem to have any particular destination in mind. There was no goal at the end of this journey other than the journey itself, the slow unspooling of my sanity as I wandered further from the world I knew. Only once did I try to stop, to turn back the way I thought we'd come. Some last vestige of self-preservation surfaced through the fog in my brain, and I made a sluggish attempt to plant my feet, to wrench myself off this dark course I'd been set upon. But the moment I did, a searing pain lanced through my skull, sending me to my knees with a choked scream. It felt like clawed fingers were raking through my mind, shredding any thought of rebellion. "You cannot leave the path," the creature said without turning, its voice echoing oddly as if from a great distance. "Not until you have seen what you must see." I struggled back to my feet, blinking away tears of pain, and fell into step behind it once more. Whatever fight I'd had left drained away like water through a sieve, replaced by a numb acceptance of my fate. What would be, and there was nothing I could do to change it. So I walked, through ancient groves where the trees grew so tall and dense no sunlight penetrated their canopy, over streams that ran black and oily and smelled of decay, across meadows dotted with luminous fungi in colors that hurt the eye to look upon. The longer we went, the more alien the forest became, until I began to doubt it was the same woods I'd patrolled and loved. This was somewhere else, a primordial place that had never known a human footstep until mine. After an eternity that was perhaps only hours or days, a change came over the creature. Its steps slowed and it began to speak, its sepulchral voice drifting back to me on the cloying air. "In the old times the people understood," it said. "They knew to respect the forest, to take only what they needed, and to leave their offerings for the spirits that dwelled within." I said nothing, conserving my energy for the relentless march. "But you modern humans," it continued with an edge of disdain, "you have lost the old ways. You barge into the deep places without caution or reverence, heedless of the forces you disturb. And then you wonder why the trees whisper of your doom." A shudder rippled through me at those words, some primal understanding that the being wasn't speaking only metaphorically. But still I kept my silence, knowing instinctively that it wasn't really me the creature was addressing. This was a lecture, a lesson it had imparted many times before. We crested a rise and it paused, turning back to fix me with its fathomless gaze. "And now you will join the others who came before, those who were marked by the forest, chosen to learn the price of trespassing in the domain of the elder things. Look upon them and despair." My heart seized as I looked to where a gnarled finger pointed. There, in a hollow at the base of the rise, was a scene out of a nightmare. Dozens of desiccated bodies lay in contorted heaps, overgrown with moss and lichen and mushrooms. Antlers like the ones the creature bore sprouted from each of their skulls, the bone cracked and pitted with age. Bile surged up my throat as I realized what I was looking at. The lost hikers, the ones who had vanished over the years, dismissed as bear attacks or misadventure. They had been here the whole time, or rather, their remains had. My gorge rose as I registered the scratches and splintered fingernails on the trunks of the surrounding trees. Even in death, they'd tried to claw their way out of this final prison. What did you do to them?" I whispered through the horror clogging my throat. The creature tilted its head, a mockery of confusion. I did nothing. The forest marked them as it marked you. They refused to pay the price, to surrender themselves to the old ways. And so they were given to the trees, to nourish the roots as a tithe, as you will be, in time." My knees gave out and I collapsed to the loamy earth, numb with shock and revulsion. How could I have been so naive, so arrogant to think I could bargain with this thing, find some way to escape its awful design? I was doomed the moment I first set foot in these woods, my fate sealed. Now I would join the grim gallery of the taken, slowly consumed by this ancient place until only bone and antler remained. Despair crashed over me in a Stygian wave. I curled in on myself, surrendering to the dark pull of this cursed forest, waiting for the roots to twine around my limbs and drag me down into the charnel earth. I don't know how long I laid there in the hollow, awaiting my grisly fate. Time had ceased to have any real meaning, flowing past in fits and starts. The creature had left me, evidently content that its work was done, that I no longer needed its guidance to meet my end. Slowly, like a diver kicking up from lightless depths, I surfaced from the mire of despair and horror that had drowned me. Blind instinct took over, the base animal urge to survive, and I started to crawl, dragging my leaden limbs over the spongy ground. I had no direction, no plan, only the knowledge that to stay in that place, amidst the moldering bones of my predecessors, was a surrender I wasn't ready to make. The forest fought me at every turn. Thorny vines wrapped around my ankles, tripping me. Jagged branches tore at my face and arms. Several times I had to stop to retch as a fetid stench washed over me, the exhalation of something large and rotten. But I pushed on, driven by a desperate, directionless need to keep moving. When the trees thinned and I stumbled out into a small meadow awash with golden light, I almost sobbed in relief. I staggered to the center and collapsed, gasping, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. But no sooner had I caught my breath than a flicker of movement at the tree line made my stomach clench anew with dread. I pushed to my feet, fear spiking beneath my ribs as a figure emerged from the shadows. But it wasn't the ghastly creature come to drag me back to its lair. It was a man, haggard and filthy, with a wild light in his eyes. He looked as surprised to see me as I was him. "You," he croaked, his voice cracked and rusty with disuse. "It got you too?" All I could do was nod, my own voice trapped behind the pulse hammering in my throat. The man limped closer and I saw that he was grievously injured, his clothes shredded and dark with old blood. Livid scars crisscrossed the skin of his arms and face, and I blanched as I recognized the pattern from the effigy carved into the tree where this nightmare had begun. "How long?" I rasped, dreading the answer even as I asked the question. "How long have you been out here?" He barked a humorless laugh, more a cough than anything. "Feels like forever, months, maybe years. Hard to tell the way things move out here." A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. I'd already felt my grip on reality starting to fray at the edges. How much of myself would be left if I was trapped in this hellscape for months or more? "I'm Ethan," I said abruptly, feeling a desperate need to cling to some shred of normalcy, of human connection in the face of this impossible circumstance. "Damien," he returned, then shook his head as if the name was unfamiliar on his tongue. "Although I suppose names don't mean much anymore, do they?" "That thing," I swallowed hard. "It said we were marked, chosen, that we're supposed to give ourselves over to the forest, to the old ways. What does that mean?" Damien's gaze sharpened, and he took an urgent step towards me. "Don't you listen to that bastard. It's not some ancient protector of nature. It's evil, pure and simple, feeds on fear, despair. It drove me half mad with whispers, visions, twisted my reality until I barely knew which way was up." I shuddered, remembering the disjointed fragments of time in the creature's thrall. "But those bodies, the ones with the antlers, they didn't escape. What chance do we have?" Damien gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging in painfully. "We have each other. Two is better than one. I've been mapping this place as much as you can map something that never stays still. I think I found a way out, or at least a chance at one." What is it?" I asked, barely daring to hope. He glanced around as if afraid of being overheard. "There's a place deep in the woods, a clearing where the trees grow in a perfect circle. I've seen it in dreams, visions. I think it might be a doorway of sorts. A way to step outside this forest that isn't a forest." It sounded like a fairy tale, a feverish hallucination. But what choice did I have? Staying here was a guaranteed descent into madness and death. If there was even a chance. A renewed sense of purpose burned through my veins, cauterizing the wounds of hopelessness and fear. I met Damien's wild gaze and nodded, some unspoken pact sealed between us. "Okay, let's find this door." We set off through the trees, Damien leading the way with grim determination. Despite his haggard appearance, he moved with a surety that spoke of hard-earned familiarity with the shifting landscape. I followed close behind, terrified of losing sight of him for even a moment, lest the forest swallow me whole. As we walked, he spoke in hushed tones of his experiences, the horrors he'd witnessed. Apparitions of friends and family, long dead, appearing between the trees, mouths yawning in silent screams. Shadows that moved with a predatory intelligence, dogging his steps. Time and again he'd tried to escape, only to find himself turned around, deposited back at the feet of the creature that had taken him. "It's playing with us," he said, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage, like a cat with a mouse, letting us wear ourselves out with false hope before it delivers the killing blow. I shuddered, remembering how easily I'd fallen under the creature's thrall. Even now I could feel the lingering pull of it, dark tendrils wrapping around my mind. It was all I could do to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, to cling to Damien's words as a lifeline. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, painting the forest in lurid shades of orange and red, a flicker of movement in the underbrush made us freeze. Damien held up a warning hand, his whole body coiled with tension. For a moment there was only the buzz of insects, the faraway cry of a bird. Then the bushes parted, and a figure stumbled out onto the path ahead. It was a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her clothes were torn and muddy, her dark hair snarled with leaves. She stared at us with wide, terrified eyes. "Please," she whimpered, her voice hitching with sobs. "I'm lost. I want my mom." Every instinct screamed at me to go to her, to gather her up and tell her it would be all right. But Damien's hand on my arm stopped me. When I turned to him, his face was a mask of anguish. "It's not real," he said hoarsely. "It's another trick, to lure us off the path." The girl took a halting step forward, her small hands outstretched. "Please, misters, I'm so scared." Tears burned my eyes as I looked at her, at the very image of innocence and vulnerability. How could this be anything but what it appeared? What if it was a real child, lost and alone like we were? Damien's grip tightened, his fingers digging into my bicep. "Ethan, no. Remember where we are, what we're dealing with. It will use our compassion against us." The girl's face crumpled and she began to cry in earnest, great heaving sobs that shook her thin frame. I felt my resolve weakening. If there was even a chance she was real, how could I leave her? But something in Damien's expression, the desperate certainty, made me pause. And in that moment of hesitation, I saw it. The briefest flicker in the girl's eyes. A fleeting glimpse of something ancient and inhuman, a fathomless hunger. An icy dagger of fear pierced my heart. Damien was right. It was a deception, a cruel illusion conjured by the creature to lead us astray. Hating myself, I wrenched my gaze away from the weeping child and let Damien pull me onwards, deeper into the darkening wood. The girl's pitiful cries chased us, each one tearing at my soul like thorns. But I put one leaden foot in front of the other, clinging to the desperate hope that we could outrun our own damnation. Night fell, full and suffocating. The creature's realm truly came alive in the darkness, shadows twisting into grotesque forms that scrabbled at the edges of our vision. Guttural snarls and distant screams rode the fetid breeze, raising gooseflesh on our arms. Exhaustion dragged at every limb, but dread spurred us on in a shambling parody of a run. I had become unmoored, sanity unspooling into the abyss. Only Damien's presence at my side, our fingers twined in a desperate grip, kept me from breaking entirely. When the trees abruptly gave way and we stumbled into a clearing, it took a long moment for my beleaguered mind to register what I was seeing. A perfectly circular meadow, just as Damien had described. And there at the center, a shimmering, undulating veil of mist that could only be the doorway. Our salvation. I made to lurch forward, but Damien threw out an arm to stop me, his features drawn tight with sudden anxiety. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "It's too easy. After all this time, why now?" As if in answer, a grating chuckle echoed through the glade. Dread pooling like ice water in my gut, I turned to face our tormentor as it oozed from the shadows. "Clever boys," it hissed through teeth like needles. "You found the door, and now you have a choice to make." "Let us go," Damien snarled, his voice trembling with mingled fear and fury. "We played your game, you sick bastard. It's over." The creature shook its head almost pityingly. "Oh, it's only just begun. The door will only open for one of you. The other must remain. Such is the price." A roaring sound filled my ears, horror and despair crashing over me in a tidal wave. Of course it was a trick. A final cruel jape, dangling escape in front of us only to snatch it away. "Why?" I croaked, barely recognizing my own voice. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can." It smiled, and the sight was hellish. "Because your pain sustains me, and now you must choose. Who will bleed so the other may go free?" Damien and I looked at each other, stricken. In that moment I saw my own anguish mirrored in his face, the awful knowledge that for one of us this was the end of the line. There would be no happy ending, no tearful reunions. One would walk through the door, the other would be left to the mercies of the creature. "Ethan!" Damien swallowed convulsively. "You should go. You've only been here a short while. You have a chance to pick up your life again. Move past this. I'm already lost." I shook my head fiercely, even as tears blurred my vision. No, no, I can't leave you here. We go together or not at all." The creature made a sound of mocking pity. "How noble, how foolish. You would condemn yourselves in the name of sentiment?" I had hoped for more. Pragmatism. I ignored it, gripping Damien's shoulders, trying to impart what meager strength I had left. "Don't you dare give up now," I growled. "We're so close. We can beat this thing." Desperation flared in his eyes. "How?" It said. "I don't care what it said." The words tore from my throat in a ragged scream. "I won't play by its rules anymore. This ends now." Maybe it was madness, maybe some last defiant surge of adrenaline, but I released Damien and lunged for the door, only to collide with the unyielding planes of the creature's chest as it appeared in front of me. I rebounded, hitting the ground hard enough to rattle my teeth. Above me the entity loomed, its eyes two pits of endless black. "Foolish creature," it spat. "Did you think it would be so easy? You cannot—" It broke off with a shriek and staggered sideways. Uncomprehending, I stared at the ragged wound that had opened in its bark-like flesh, and the bloodied stone clutched in Damien's fist. He grabbed my arm, wrenching me to my feet. "Now, while it's distracted, go! Not without you!" I panted, dragging him towards the shimmering portal. The creature thrashed and gibbered behind us, its form writhing obscenely as dark ichor pulsed from the hole in its chest. We stumbled to the doorway, its surface undulating like a living thing. I could feel the pull of it, a siren song luring me onwards to blessed normalcy, a life outside this nightmare. But Damien's grip had slackened, his steps faltering. I looked back to see his ashen face, his eyes glazing over with pain and exhaustion. "I can't," he whispered through bloodless lips. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm not strong enough." Behind us, the creature let out a whistling scream of rage, shaking off its wound as it staggered upright. Its inhuman gaze bored into me with laser focus, seeing its quarry about to slip through its grasp. In that crystallized moment, I made my choice. If we couldn't leave together, then I would not leave at all. I would not abandon Damien to face the darkness alone, would not grant the entity its victory. Slowly, deliberately, I turned my back on the shimmering door and the promise of freedom. Instead, I wrapped an arm around Damien's waist, taking his weight as he slumped against me. "Looks like you're stuck with me," I said, a ghost of a smile tugging at my cracked lips. "I guess we'll have to be each other's light in the dark." The creature loosed an ear-splitting howl of fury as we stepped back into the shadows of the forest. Not as prisoners, but as something else. Something no longer willing to abide by the laws of its realm. We had no illusions our trials were over. This place, the entity that ruled it, would hunt us, forever seeking to break our spirits and claim us for its own. But we would face it together, Damien and I. Our bond was our strength, our defiance, our weapon. And somehow, I knew it would be enough. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us was the creature's hate-filled gaze. But for the first time, I thought I detected a flicker of something else in those fathomless depths. The summer heat was oppressive as our family's moving truck wound its way through the dense Pennsylvania forests in August 1999. At 13 years old, I wasn't thrilled about leaving our comfortable Long Island home for what felt like the middle of nowhere. The narrow roads seemed to stretch endlessly through thick woods, each turn taking us further from civilization. Our new home sat isolated on 5 acres of land near the New York-New Jersey border. The white single-wide trailer looked painfully out of place against the dark tree line that surrounded it on 3 sides. A gravel driveway snaked up to the front door with tall grass and weeds fighting their way through the stones. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, not that we could see their house through the dense forest. My mother tried to stay optimistic as we unloaded boxes, pointing out the charming details of our new home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The woods felt like they were watching us, waiting. Even in broad daylight, shadows seemed to move between the trees. That first night, I lay awake in the bedroom I shared with my younger brothers, listening to unfamiliar sounds. The wind through the trees created eerie whispers. Branches scraped against the thin trailer walls. Every creak and groan of our new home made me jump. But exhaustion eventually won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next few weeks passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. I started 8th grade at the local middle school, making a few acquaintances but no close friends. Most of my classmates had known each other since kindergarten and viewed newcomers with suspicion. I spent my afternoons exploring the property, always careful to stay within sight of the trailer. Something about those woods made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. By early October, the days were getting shorter and the nights longer. The forest took on new shadows as the leaves began to turn and fall. One particularly cold evening, I was alone in our shared bedroom, trying to focus on homework. My brothers were watching TV with our parents in the living room, but I had a math test the next day. The first odd thing I noticed was the silence. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant owls, had completely stopped. The quiet felt heavy, oppressive. Then came the sensation of being watched. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, but the feeling grew stronger until I couldn't concentrate on my textbook. A sharp tap on the window made me freeze. It wasn't the random noise of a falling branch or acorn. It was deliberate, like knuckles rapping on glass. I sat perfectly still, heart pounding. Another tap, slightly louder this time. Part of me wanted to run from the room, but curiosity won out. Slowly, I turned toward the window and pulled back the thin curtain. 2 glowing yellow eyes stared back at me from the darkness. They were at least 6 feet off the ground, far too high for any local wildlife. The eyes seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and they were fixed directly on me. I could make out no face or body in the darkness, just those terrible, burning eyes. I dropped the curtain and ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. My family found me trembling in the living room, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I'd seen. Who would believe me? My mother would blame an overactive imagination or say it was just a reflection. But I knew what I saw was real. The encounters didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening with increasing frequency. Items would go missing from the yard only to reappear days later in different locations. Deep scratches appeared on the outside walls of the trailer, too high up for any normal animal to reach. The power would cut out randomly, even on clear nights with no storms. My brothers remained oblivious, but I noticed my parents exchanging worried glances when they thought we weren't looking. The financial strain of the move had been significant, and I overheard them discussing whether we could afford to move again so soon. But where would we go? One night in late October, I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps on the roof. They moved slowly from one end of the trailer to the other, the thin metal roof creaking under their weight. My brothers slept soundly, but I lay rigid in my bed, listening as whatever it was paced back and forth. The footsteps finally stopped directly above my bed. There was a long moment of silence, then 3 sharp taps on the roof, directly mirroring the knocks I'd heard on the window weeks before. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child, as if that could protect me from whatever was out there. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror as I waited for something to break through the ceiling. When morning finally came, I ran outside to check the roof. Deep dents marked where the footsteps had been, and long scratch marks trailed across the metal surface. After the roof incident, I began researching obsessively. I spent hours at the school library reading local history books and newspapers on microfiche. The librarian gave me strange looks as I requested articles about mysterious deaths and disappearances in the area, but I needed answers. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 50 years, dozens of people had vanished in the surrounding forests. Most were hikers or campers, but some had disappeared from their own properties. The cases followed a pattern. They typically occurred in autumn, and witnesses often reported seeing strange lights or hearing unusual sounds in the woods before the disappearances. One article from 1973 caught my attention. A local hunter described encountering a tall figure with glowing eyes while tracking deer at dusk. The figure seemed to be watching him from between the trees, always staying just at the edge of visibility. When the hunter raised his rifle, the figure vanished, leaving only deep footprints in the frozen ground. The description matched what I'd seen perfectly. As November approached, the activity around our home intensified. The yellow eyes appeared almost nightly now, watching from different windows. Sometimes they would stay for hours, other times just long enough to let me know they were there. I began sleeping in the living room, claiming nightmares to avoid questions from my family. But the entity, whatever it was, seemed to be growing bolder. One evening I was taking out the trash at dusk when I saw movement at the tree line. A figure stood partially hidden behind a large oak tree, unnaturally tall and thin. As I watched, frozen in place, it stepped slightly forward. The yellow eyes blazed in the growing darkness, and I could make out long, pale limbs that seemed wrong somehow. Too many joints, moving in ways human limbs shouldn't move. I dropped the trash bag and ran inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. Through the kitchen window I saw the figure emerge fully from the trees. It moved with an odd, fluid grace across our yard, coming closer to the house. Its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, neck too thin, fingers like spider legs. But worst of all were those eyes, now level with the window as it pressed its face against the glass. I screamed then, bringing my family running. By the time they reached the kitchen, the figure had vanished, leaving only condensation on the window where its breath had fogged the glass. The weekend before Thanksgiving brought the first snow of the season. I woke early that Saturday morning to find the world transformed into a white wonderland. The peace was short-lived. As I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, I noticed something disturbing. A single set of tracks in the fresh snow, circling our trailer countless times. The tracks were huge, easily twice the size of a human foot, and they seemed to have appeared from nowhere. They started and ended abruptly at the tree line, with no connecting tracks leading away. That evening, the power went out again. As my father went to check the circuit breaker, we heard his shout of surprise. The electrical box had been torn open, its wires shredded. But more disturbing were the deep claw marks gouged into the metal casing, and the height of the damage, nearly 8 feet off the ground. We huddled together in the living room that night, illuminated by flashlights and candles. The temperature dropped steadily as our electric heat failed. Around midnight, the scratching began, soft at first, then growing louder. It moved around the trailer, walls creaking under the pressure of whatever was trying to get in. We could hear it testing each window, each door, searching for weakness. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by heavy footsteps on the roof. One by one, the skylights shattered as massive hands punched through them, sending glass raining down. My mother grabbed my youngest brother and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't open. Something was holding it shut from the outside. What happened next remains burned into my memory with perfect clarity. As we huddled in the center of the living room, a long, pale arm reached through one of the broken skylights. Its fingers were impossibly long and jointed, ending in sharp black claws. The arm feeling blindly around the room, searching. My father, armed with a baseball bat, swung at the reaching limb. There was a horrible screech, not quite human, not quite animal, and the arm withdrew. For a moment, we thought it was over. Then those yellow eyes appeared at every window simultaneously, staring in at us from all directions. The walls began to shake as multiple sets of claws tore at the trailer's thin metal siding. The front door burst open with a crash, letting in a blast of frigid air. Silhouetted in the doorway was a figure that defied description, impossibly tall and thin, with too many limbs moving in impossible ways. The yellow eyes blazed like funeral pyres in its elongated face. As it began to step inside, my father threw his baseball bat with all his strength, striking the creature directly between its glowing eyes. The thing reeled backward with an ear-splitting shriek. We took advantage of its momentary distraction to run past it, piling into our car. My father floored the accelerator, tires spinning in the snow before finding purchase. As we sped down the driveway, I looked back to see the creature watching us from beside the trailer, its yellow eyes seeming to burn with hatred. We never returned to the trailer. My father went back once during daylight hours and accompanied by 2 police officers to retrieve essential belongings. They found the place torn apart, walls shredded, furniture destroyed, deep claw marks everywhere. The officers wrote it off as vandalism, maybe bears, but we knew better. We moved in with my aunt in New Jersey while my parents sorted out their finances. Eventually, we found a new home in a suburban development, no forests in sight. The property in Pennsylvania was sold at a significant loss, but we were just grateful to be rid of it. Years later, I tried researching the area again. I discovered that the new owners of our old property stayed less than 6 months before abandoning it. The trailer still stands empty, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to spend the night there, telling stories about the monster with yellow eyes that stalks the property. I'm in my late 30s now, with a family of my own. We live in a busy city surrounded by people and concrete. But sometimes, on dark autumn nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear scratching at my window. And in those moments I lie perfectly still, afraid to look outside, knowing what I might see staring back at me with those terrible yellow eyes. It was the fall of 2002 when my life changed forever. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science, and eager to start my career. Landing a job as a park ranger in northern Minnesota felt like a dream come true. The Whispering Pines National Park was a vast expanse of pristine wilderness, towering evergreens, crystal-clear lakes, and rugged hiking trails that seemed to stretch on forever. My name is James Hawkins, and this is my story. A story I've kept buried for over 2 decades, afraid that speaking it aloud would somehow make it more real. But the weight of carrying this secret has become too much to bear. Perhaps by sharing it, I can finally find some measure of peace. The park itself was breathtaking. Covering over 100,000 acres, it was a haven for nature lovers and outdoor enthusiasts. Despite its size, the park was chronically understaffed. There were only 5 full-time rangers, including myself, to patrol and maintain the entire area. This meant long shifts, often working alone in remote sections of the park. At first, I relished the solitude. There was something magical about being surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife, the modern world feeling a million miles away. My days were filled with routine tasks, maintaining trails, assisting lost hikers, and ensuring campsites were kept clean. Nights were spent either patrolling in my truck or manning the small ranger station near the park's main entrance. Everything seemed perfect. I was living my passion, spending my days in nature and my nights under a canopy of stars, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. But as September faded into October, a subtle shift began to occur. Something in the air changed, a tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with the silence. Anyone who's spent time in the wilderness knows that nature is rarely quiet. Even at night, there's a constant symphony of sounds: crickets chirping, owls hooting, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But suddenly there were moments when all of that would just stop. The first time it happened, I was doing a routine check of the campsites near Pine Lake. It was just after sunset, that twilight hour when the world seems to hold its breath between day and night. I remember it vividly. One moment the forest was alive with its usual nocturnal chorus. The next, absolute silence descended like a heavy blanket. The sudden absence of sound was so profound that I actually stopped in my tracks, my hand instinctively going to the radio at my belt. The silence pressed against my eardrums, making them ring. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear anything: a bird call, a snapping twig, even the whisper of wind through the trees. But there was nothing. Just as I was about to key my radio to check in with the station, the sounds of the forest rushed back in a cacophonous wave. It was so abrupt and jarring that I actually jumped, my heart racing. I tried to laugh it off, to convince myself it was just a strange anomaly. But deep down, in that primal part of the brain that recognizes danger before our conscious mind can process it, I knew something wasn't right. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, these pockets of unnatural silence became more frequent. Other rangers noticed it too, though we rarely spoke about it directly. It was as if acknowledging it would somehow make it more real, more threatening. But it wasn't just the silence that was changing. The very atmosphere of the park seemed to shift. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that set my teeth on edge. Shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were trying to reach out and grab you. And always there was that feeling of being watched. I'd be out on patrol, miles from the nearest campsite or hiking trail, and suddenly the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. That prickling sensation of eyes boring into you, studying your every move. I'd spin around, flashlight in hand, heart pounding, but there was never anything there, just trees and shadows and that oppressive silence. As October wore on, the incidents became more frequent and more disturbing. Campers began reporting strange occurrences, eerie sounds in the night, glimpses of shadowy figures at the edge of their campsites. At first, it was easy to dismiss these as the product of overactive imaginations, city folk unaccustomed to the noises and shadows of the forest at night. But then the stories started to become more specific, more alarming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and ancient had awakened in Whispering Pines National Park. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, an undercurrent of fear began to ripple through the park. It wasn't just the campers anymore. Even seasoned hikers and locals who had been coming to Whispering Pines for years were starting to feel uneasy. The reports started trickling in slowly at first. A couple on a weekend getaway claimed they heard what sounded like whispers coming from the trees surrounding their campsite. When they shone their flashlight into the woods, they swore they saw something dart between the trunks, something far too large to be any of the local wildlife. A group of college students on a camping trip packed up and left in the middle of the night, leaving most of their gear behind. When they came to the ranger station the next morning, they were pale and shaken. They spoke of hearing heavy footsteps circling their tents, of seeing impossibly tall, thin shadows moving against the tree line. At first, I tried to rationalize these incidents. The whispers could have been the wind. The movement in the trees might have been a deer or even a bear. The footsteps around the tent? Probably a curious raccoon or maybe even a prankster from another campsite. But as the reports kept coming in, each one more disturbing than the last, it became harder to dismiss them, especially when I started experiencing things myself. It was about 2 weeks into October when I had my first truly inexplicable encounter. I was doing a late-night patrol of the more remote campsites on the northern edge of the park. It was a moonless night, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow up your flashlight beam. I had just finished checking on a family of 4 who were spending the week at one of our rustic cabins. As I was walking back to my truck, that now familiar silence fell. The crunch of leaves under my boots seemed obscenely loud in the stillness. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or any other animal I could identify. It was deeper, more primordial somehow. I froze, my hand going to the pepper spray on my belt. We weren't allowed to carry firearms in the park. The sound came again, closer this time. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My training kicked in, and I slowly began to back towards my truck, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, something moved. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it clearly, a figure impossibly tall and thin, standing between 2 ancient pines. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms hung down past where knees should be, ending in hands with fingers that seemed too long, too sharp. Its head was oddly elongated, and though I couldn't make out any features, I had the terrible sense that it was looking right at me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stood there, the thing and I, locked in a silent standoff. Then, with a movement so fast I almost missed it, it simply vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, leaving nothing but that oppressive silence and the thundering of my own heart. I'd like to say I acted bravely, that I investigated further or radioed for backup. The truth is, I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not stopping until I was in my truck with the doors locked and the engine running. As I sped back to the ranger station, my mind raced. What had I just seen? Was it real, or had the stress and long hours finally gotten to me? I wanted desperately to believe it was just a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination brought on by fatigue and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. Something was in our park, something that didn't belong, and it was only going to get worse. The days following my encounter in the woods were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious patrols. I found myself jumping at every shadow, every unexpected sound, The other rangers noticed my change in demeanor, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I'd seen. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? It was Harold, the oldest and most experienced ranger on our team, who finally cornered me about it. He found me one morning, staring blankly into my coffee in the break room of the ranger station. "All right, James," he said, pulling up a chair across from me. "What's eating you?" I considered brushing him off, making up some excuse about not sleeping well. But the concern in his eyes broke through my resolve. Over the next hour I poured out everything, the unnatural silences, the feeling of being watched, and finally, my terrifying encounter in the woods. To my surprise, Harold didn't laugh or dismiss my story. Instead, he listened intently, his weathered face growing more serious with each passing minute. When I finished, he let out a long, heavy sigh. "I was afraid of this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Afraid of what?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Harold leaned in close, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Have you ever heard of the Wendigo?" The name sent a shiver through me. Of course I had heard of it. Growing up in Minnesota, the legend of the Wendigo was as familiar as any campfire story. A malevolent spirit of the northern forests, said to possess humans and drive them to acts of cannibalism and madness. "It's just a myth," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Harold shook his head slowly. "Some myths have roots in truth, son, and some truths are too terrible for most folks to face." He went on to tell me that every few decades, strange things would start happening in the park. Animals would go missing, campers would report bizarre sightings, and that unnatural silence would settle over the woods. He spoke of his grandfather, who had worked in the park back in the 1930s during what he called a bad cycle. "A whole group of campers vanished without a trace," Harold said, his eyes distant with the memory. "Search parties combed these woods for weeks, never found so much as a scrap of clothing. I wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, the ramblings of an old man, but after what I'd seen I couldn't." What do we do?" I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. Harold's expression was grim. "We stay vigilant, we protect the people in this park as best we can, and we pray that whatever's out there doesn't decide to make itself known in a bigger way." He made me promise not to go out alone after dark if I could help it. "There are things in these woods that we don't understand," he warned, "things that can be more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion." As I left the break room that day, I felt a weight settle onto my shoulders. The wonder and excitement I had felt when I first started this job had been replaced by a gnawing dread. The forest that had once seemed so welcoming now felt alien and hostile. But I had a job to do. People came to this park to connect with nature, to escape the stresses of their everyday lives. They trusted us to keep them safe. I couldn't let my fear get in the way of that responsibility, so I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor. I doubled my patrols, checked and rechecked the emergency equipment, and made sure every camper was well informed about park safety regulations. All the while I kept my eyes open, watching for any sign of the thing I had seen in the woods. As October wore on, the tension in the park continued to build. More campers reported strange sightings and eerie experiences. We had an unusually high number of people cutting their trips short, claiming they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. There were incidents of vandalism, tents slashed open, supplies scattered, and in one particularly disturbing case, a campsite where we found small animal carcasses arranged in bizarre patterns. Many of my colleagues dismissed these as the work of some sick prankster, but I knew better. The old ranger's warnings echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were building towards something big, something terrible. As Halloween approached, I found myself dreading each shift more and more. The darkness seemed to press in closer each night, and that feeling of being watched was nearly constant now. I took to carrying a larger flashlight and made sure my radio was always fully charged. But deep down, I knew that if I encountered that thing in the woods again, no amount of preparation would be enough. October 30th dawned cold and gray, a thick blanket of fog clinging to the treetops and obscuring the mountaintops in the distance. As I drove to work that morning, an inexplicable sense of foreboding settled over me. It was as if the very air was charged with a malevolent energy, waiting to be released. The day passed in a blur of activity. Despite the late season and the increasingly disturbing rumors circulating about the park, we had an unexpected influx of visitors. It seemed everyone wanted to get in one last camping trip before winter set in. Or perhaps they were drawn by the promise of a spooky Halloween experience in the woods. By the time my shift was supposed to end at 10 p.m., I was exhausted. But as I was preparing to leave, a group of late arrivals came stumbling into the ranger station, lost and disoriented. By the time I got them settled into their campsite and made it back to the office, it was well past midnight. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to get in my truck and drive as far away from the park as I could. But I had paperwork to finish, and I told myself that another hour wouldn't hurt. It was a decision I would come to regret for the rest of my life. As I sat at my desk, the only sound the scratching of my pen and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, I became acutely aware of the silence outside. Not the natural quiet of a forest at night, but that oppressive, unnatural silence that had become all too familiar over the past month. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows in the corners of the office seemed darker, more substantial somehow. Every few minutes I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. It was nearing 1 a.m. when I finally decided I'd had enough. I quickly gathered my things, my hands shaking slightly as I pulled on my jacket. As I reached for the door, a sound from outside froze me in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves just outside the ranger station. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The steps were uneven, with an odd cadence that didn't sound quite human. They seemed to be circling the building, drawing closer to the front door with each pass. Heart pounding, I reached for the radio at my belt, only to remember with a jolt of panic that I'd left it charging on my desk. I was alone, unarmed save for a can of pepper spray, with something prowling just outside. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. For a long, terrible moment there was only silence. Then a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days, the slow, agonizing scrape of something sharp against the wooden door. I stumbled backward, my eyes fixed on the door handle. In my mind I could see it turning, could almost feel the presence on the other side preparing to enter. But it didn't move. Instead, a shadow passed by the window next to the door. Tall, impossibly tall, its elongated silhouette briefly blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the fog. I caught a glimpse of something that might have been a face, sunken eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light, a mouth stretched far too wide. A whimper escaped my throat, and I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle any further sound. The shadow paused, and I swear I could feel its gaze boring into me through the glass. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The silence outside gave way to the normal sounds of the forest at night, as if a spell had been broken. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I finally worked up the courage to move. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled to my desk, fumbling for my radio with trembling hands. I keyed the mic, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is Ranger Hawkins at the main station. Does anyone copy? Over." Static was my only reply. I tried again, desperation creeping into my voice, but still nothing. Either there was no one else on duty or something was interfering with the signal. I was on my own. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I sank into my chair, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it the same creature I'd encountered in the woods weeks ago? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? My first instinct was to run, to make a break for my truck and drive as fast and as far as I could. But what if it was still out there, waiting? And even if I did manage to escape, what about the campers scattered throughout the park? I couldn't just abandon them. As I sat there, paralyzed by indecision, a new sound reached my ears. A low, keening wail, barely audible at first but steadily growing louder. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal, but filled with a bone-deep anguish that made my skin crawl. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the campgrounds. In that moment, my training kicked in, overriding my fear. Whatever was happening, there were people out there who might need help. I had a duty to protect them, no matter how terrified I was. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and pepper spray. I hesitated for a moment, then reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the first aid kit we kept for emergencies. Whatever was out there, I had a feeling I might need it. Taking a deep breath, I approached the door. My hand hovered over the knob for a long moment before I finally worked up the courage to turn it. The door creaked open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The air outside was frigid, my breath misting in front of me as I swept my flashlight beam across the parking lot. Nothing moved in the shadows. The wailing had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. I made my way to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that tall, impossible figure looming behind me. But I made it without incident, the familiar rumble of the engine offering a small measure of comfort as I pulled out of the parking lot. As I drove towards the campgrounds, my headlights cutting through the fog, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving towards something I wasn't prepared to face, something that would change everything. I was right. The road to the campgrounds wound through the densest part of the forest, ancient pines looming on either side like silent sentinels. My headlights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead. As I rounded a bend, something darted across the road, a fleeting shadow that was there and gone so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the leaf-strewn asphalt. Heart pounding, I peered out into the darkness. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, just at the edge of my headlight's reach, I saw movement. Something was weaving between the trees, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. I should have driven on, should have radioed for backup, even though I knew my calls would go unanswered, or headed straight for the campgrounds to check on the visitors. Instead, driven by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, I did the unthinkable. I got out of the truck. The forest was eerily silent as I stepped onto the road, my flashlight beam sweeping the tree line. The fog had thickened, curling around my ankles like ghostly fingers. I took a tentative step towards the woods, then another. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast darkness. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" A twig snapped somewhere to my left. I whirled towards the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something pale and emaciated disappearing behind a tree. "Wait!" I shouted, all common sense abandoning me as I plunged into the underbrush. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear something moving ahead of me, always just out of sight. The fog grew thicker until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, leaves and twigs scratching at my skin as I rolled. I came to a stop at the bottom, the wind knocked out of me, my flashlight flying from my grasp. As I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath, I became aware of a presence. Something was standing over me. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I raised my eyes. It was the creature from my nightmares, the thing I'd glimpsed in the woods and outside the ranger station. In the dim light of my fallen flashlight, I could finally see it clearly. It was vaguely humanoid, but stretched and distorted in impossible ways. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at unnatural angles. The skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over protruding bones, but it was the face that would haunt me for years to come. Sunken, glowing eyes stared down at me from deep sockets. The mouth was a gash across the lower half of its face, filled with needle-sharp teeth. As I watched in horror, that mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to, a long black tongue snaking out to taste the air. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. The creature crouched down, its face inches from mine. I could smell its breath, the stench of decay and something metallic that I realized with dawning horror was blood. It reached out one long-fingered hand towards my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain that this was the end. But the touch never came. Instead, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Words spoken in a voice like dry leaves rustling. "You shouldn't be here." My eyes flew open in shock. The creature was gone. I was alone in the dark forest, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Shaking uncontrollably, I scrambled to my feet, snatching up my flashlight. I ran blindly through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, until I burst out onto the road. My truck was still there, engine idling, headlights cutting through the fog. I all but dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, a movement in my rearview mirror caught my eye. There, at the edge of the woods, stood the creature. It raised one impossibly long arm in what almost seemed like a wave. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I threw the truck into drive and sped down the road, my mind reeling. What had I just encountered? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? As I sped down the winding road towards the campgrounds, my mind was reeling from the encounter in the woods. The creature's words echoed in my head. "You shouldn't be here." Was it a warning? A threat? I couldn't be sure, but I knew one thing. I had to check on the campers. The main campground came into view, a cluster of tents and RVs nestled in a clearing. As I pulled up, I immediately sensed something was wrong. It was too quiet. Even at this late hour, there should have been some signs of life. A lantern glowing in a tent, the soft murmur of late-night conversations. Instead, there was nothing but silence. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, my senses on high alert. The fog had followed me here, curling around the campsite in ghostly tendrils. As I moved between the tents, calling out softly, I was met with no response. Then I saw it, a tent with its flap torn open. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam revealing the interior. Sleeping bags were strewn about, personal belongings scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. But there was no sign of the occupants. A chill ran down my spine as I moved to the next campsite, finding a similar scene. And the next, and the next. The entire campground seemed to have been abandoned, and recently. As I reached the far end of the clearing, a sound caught my attention, a faint whimper coming from behind a large RV. I rounded the corner, my flashlight illuminating a huddled figure. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. She was curled up against the RV's tire, her eyes wide with terror. When my light hit her, she let out a strangled cry and tried to scramble away. "It's okay," I said quickly, lowering my flashlight. "I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help. What happened?" The woman, Claire I would later learn, stared at me for a long moment before bursting into tears. Between sobs, she told me a story that chilled me to the bone. She and her friends had been sitting around the campfire when the silence fell. At first they thought nothing of it, but then they started hearing noises, whispers in the dark, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. One by one, people started disappearing into the woods, as if in a trance. Claire had hidden, watching in horror as her friends walked into the darkness, following something she couldn't quite see. "It was tall," she whispered, her eyes unfocused as if seeing it again. So tall and wrong. Everything about it was wrong. I helped Claire to her feet and got her into my truck. As we drove back to the ranger station, I tried to radio for help again, but was met with nothing but static. We were on our own. Back at the ranger station, I sat Claire down with a blanket and a cup of hot coffee. Her hands shook as she sipped, her eyes darting to the windows every few seconds as if expecting something to burst through. I was about to suggest we try to leave the park when the door to the station burst open. I whirled around, half expecting to see the creature, but instead found myself face to face with Harold, the old ranger. "Thank God you're here," I started to say, but the look on his face stopped me cold. "It's happening again," Harold said, his voice grave, "just like in 32. Over the next hour, Harold revealed a truth that shook me to my core. The legend of the Wendigo wasn't just a story, it was real. Every few decades, something would awaken in the forest, something ancient and hungry. It would lure people into the woods, possessing some, consuming others. But why, I asked, struggling to process this information. Why is this happening? Harold's eyes were sad as he looked at me. "The land remembers," he said softly. "It remembers the atrocities committed here, the broken treaties, the lives destroyed, and sometimes it seeks retribution." As Harold spoke, I felt a shift in the air. The lights in the station flickered, and that oppressive silence fell once again. Claire whimpered, pressing herself into a corner. "It's here," Harold whispered. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. The windows of the station exploded inward, showering us with glass. Claire screamed as a long, pale arm reached through, grasping at the air. Harold moved with a speed that belied his age, pulling an ancient-looking rifle from a hidden compartment. "Iron and sage," he yelled over the chaos. "It's the only thing that can hurt it." I grabbed Claire and we made a run for the back door. As we burst out into the night, I could hear the sound of splintering wood behind us. The creature was inside. We ran for the tree line, the sound of pursuit close behind. I could hear Harold's rifle going off, the shots echoing through the forest. Then suddenly silence. We stopped, gasping for breath. The forest around us was deathly quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. Just silence. Then a voice, that same dry, rustling voice I'd heard in the woods. But this time it wasn't just a few words. It was speaking clearly, and what it said made my blood run cold. "This land is not yours," it said. "It never was. You are trespassers here, all of you, and now you will pay the price." The creature stepped into view, its elongated form towering over us. In the dim light of dawn, I could see the faces of the missing campers reflected in its eyes, their expressions twisted in eternal agony. I knew in that moment that we couldn't run, couldn't hide. This was a reckoning long overdue, a balancing of scales that had been tipped for far too long. As the creature reached for us, I closed my eyes, acceptance washing over me. This was the truth of Whispering Pines, the dark secret that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The last thing I remember is a blinding flash of light, and then nothing. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, Claire in the room next door. They told us we'd been found at the edge of the park, dehydrated and delirious. Harold was gone, presumed lost in the woods. The official report cited a freak storm and mass hysteria to explain the events of that night. But I know the truth. I see it in Claire's eyes when we talk, hear it in the silence that sometimes falls in the middle of a crowded room. The land remembers, and sometimes it demands a reckoning. I never returned to Whispering Pines. I couldn't. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear that voice again. And I wonder, when will it return? And who will pay the price next time? The old cabin stood silently at the edge of Lake Obsidian, its weathered wooden exterior a testament to years of enduring harsh New Hampshire winters. My parents, Robert and Helen Lancaster, had purchased this quaint retreat back in 2015, drawn to its rustic charm and the promise of peaceful summers away from the bustle of city life. I'm James Lancaster, 37 years old, and this is my account of the events that transpired at that cabin 5 years ago. But before I delve into the heart of this chilling tale, let me provide some context about myself and my family. My wife Catherine and I have been married for 14 wonderful years. We're the proud parents of 5 children, our oldest, William, who was 9 at the time of the incident, our daughter Emma, who was 4, and our younger 3 who came along in the years that followed. I work as a software engineer while Catherine is a pediatric nurse. We lead what most would consider a normal, happy life. However, there's an aspect of my life that sets me apart from many. I'm a Satanist, though not in the way popular culture often portrays us. We don't sacrifice animals or perform dark rituals. Instead, my beliefs center around individualism, skepticism, and the rejection of arbitrary authority. I find beauty in the darker aspects of life, enjoy horror movies, and have a passion for gaming. More importantly, I've always been fascinated by the paranormal and cryptozoology. Throughout my life, I've experienced what I would call minor paranormal events, unexplained noises, fleeting shadows in the corner of my eye, or the occasional inexplicable feeling of being watched. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened at my parents' cabin that summer of 2020. The cabin itself was a 2-bedroom affair, rustic yet comfortable. The master bedroom, where Catherine and I slept, was on the ground floor, while the kids' room was upstairs. Large windows in every room offered breathtaking views of Lake Obsidian and the dense forest surrounding it. It was mid-June when we arrived for our week-long stay. The weather was perfect, warm days with a cool breeze coming off the lake, and nights just chilly enough to warrant a light sweater. The first few days passed uneventfully. We spent our time hiking, fishing, and enjoying the serenity of nature. William was thrilled to explore the woods, always returning with some new treasure. Interesting rocks, oddly shaped sticks, or vibrant leaves. Emma, ever the ball of energy, would chase butterflies in the meadow near the cabin or splash in the shallows of the lake under our watchful eyes. As night fell on our 4th day at the cabin, a sense of unease began to creep over me. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen as the sun set, or how the usually cheerful chirping of birds gave way to an eerie silence. I brushed it off as my overactive imagination, a side effect of my interest in the supernatural. After dinner, as Catherine and I were preparing the kids for bed, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, staring out into the gathering darkness. The forest seemed to press in closer to the cabin, the trees morphing into looming, menacing shapes. A flicker of movement caught my eye, something darting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. I blinked, and it was gone. "James?" Catherine's voice startled me. "Are you okay?" I turned to her, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just thought I saw something in the woods, probably a deer." She gave me a concerned look but didn't press further. "Okay, can you help me get Emma to bed? She's being extra squirmy tonight." As I headed upstairs to the kids' room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The process of getting our children to bed was always a challenge, but that night it seemed particularly difficult. William was easier to manage. At 9, he was content to read a book until sleep claimed him. Emma, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of energy, giggling and darting around the room as Catherine and I tried to corral her into bed. "Emma, sweetheart, it's time to sleep," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and soothing despite the growing unease in my gut. "But I'm not tired, Daddy," she protested, her blue eyes wide and pleading. "Can't I stay up just a little longer?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "No, honey, it's already past your bedtime. Come on, let's get you tucked in." Just as I thought I had her convinced, Emma let out a peal of laughter and darted past me, out of the bedroom door and down the stairs. I could hear her bare feet pattering on the wooden floor below. "I've got her," Catherine said, giving me a tired smile. "Why don't you finish getting William settled?" I nodded, turning back to our son who was already engrossed in his book. The sound of Catherine's gentle coaxing and Emma's giggles drifted up from downstairs. I sat on the edge of William's bed, my eyes drawn to the open window. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and lake water, but there was something else, a faint, musty odor that I couldn't quite place. "Dad?" William's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Is everything okay?" I looked at him, seeing the concern in his young face. Sometimes I forgot how perceptive he could be. "Everything's fine, buddy," I assured him, ruffling his hair. "Just thinking about how much I love being up here with you guys." He smiled, but I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. "I love it too, Dad, but does it feel different to you tonight?" A chill ran down my spine at his words. So I wasn't the only one who sensed it. "Different how?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. William shrugged, his eyes darting to the window. "I don't know, it just feels weird, like something's watching us." I swallowed hard, fighting to maintain a calm exterior. "It's probably just because we're not used to being in the woods," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. "There's nothing out there that can hurt us, Will. I promise." He nodded, seeming somewhat reassured. I leaned in to kiss his forehead, my hand automatically reaching to pull the covers up higher around him. "Get some sleep, okay? We've got a big day of fishing planned tomorrow." As I stood to leave, a gust of wind rattled the window, making us both jump. The trees outside seemed to sway more violently than the breeze warranted, their branches scraping against the side of the cabin like bony fingers seeking entry. I quickly crossed the room and shut the window, latching it firmly. "Just in case it rains," I explained to William, who was watching me with wide eyes. I was about to turn off the light when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold and my heart stutter in my chest. "Daddy?" It was Emma's voice, but wrong, distorted, as if coming through an old radio with poor reception. And it wasn't coming from downstairs where I knew my daughter to be. It was coming from outside the window I had just closed. For a moment I stood frozen, my hand still on the light switch. The voice came again, a warped version of my daughter's cheerful call. "Daddy, where are you?" William sat up in bed, his face pale in the dim light. "Dad, what was that?" I forced myself to move, crossing back to the window in 2 quick strides. My hands shook as I yanked the curtains open, peering out into the darkness. The forest loomed beyond the small clearing around the cabin, a wall of impenetrable black. I strained my eyes, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of my daughter's small form. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees and the faint lapping of waves on the lakeshore. "Stay here," I told William, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. "Don't open the window, don't look outside. I'm going to check on your mom and sister." I didn't wait for his response, already moving towards the door. As I reached for the handle, the voice came again, louder this time. "Daddy, help me! I'm scared!" It was Emma's voice, undoubtedly, but the electronic distortion remained, and now I could pinpoint its location more clearly. It was coming from the woods, at least 50 feet from the cabin. There was no way Emma could have gotten out there so quickly and quietly. My heart pounding, I rushed down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I burst into the kitchen to find Catherine at the sink, washing dishes. Emma sat at the table, contentedly coloring in her favorite book. "James?" Catherine turned, alarm clear on her face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain what I just heard? It defied logic, defied reality. I looked at Emma, happily humming to herself as she scribbled with her crayons. She was here, safe. But then what had I heard? I thought I heard something outside," I finally managed, my voice hoarse. "Can you keep the kids down here for a bit? I want to check around the cabin." Catherine's brow furrowed with concern. "James, it's dark out there. Maybe we should just call it a night and—" "Please," I cut her off more sharply than I intended. Softening my tone, I added, "It'll only take a few minutes. I just want to make sure everything's secure." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but be careful and take a flashlight." I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight we kept by the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cooler now, carrying a damp chill that seeped into my bones. I swept the beam of light across the yard, illuminating patches of grass and the first line of trees. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed underbrush. I circled the cabin slowly, my senses on high alert for any sound or movement. But aside from the usual nighttime forest noises, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, all was quiet. I was almost back to the porch when I heard it again. "Daddy, please, I'm lost." The voice came from directly behind me, so close I could almost feel the breath on my neck. I whirled around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just empty air and the looming trees beyond. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of trick, a prank maybe. But who would do this? We were miles from the nearest neighbor, and no one knew we were here except my parents. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion, a new sound reached my ears. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the trees and shaking me to my core. I didn't wait to see what might emerge from the shadows. I ran back to the cabin, slamming and locking the door behind me. Catherine and the kids looked up in alarm as I entered, panting and wide-eyed. "James, what?" Catherine began, but I cut her off. "We need to leave, now." Catherine stared at me, her face a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "Leave? James, it's the middle of the night. What's going on?" I ran a shaky hand through my hair, trying to find the words to explain what I'd experienced without sounding completely unhinged. I heard something out there, something that shouldn't be possible. Emma looked up from her coloring book, her eyes wide. "Was it a monster, Daddy?" "No, sweetie," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "There's no such thing as monsters. It was probably just an animal." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. What I'd heard was no animal, at least not any I'd ever encountered. Catherine stood up, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she approached me. She placed a cool hand on my forehead. "You don't have a fever, James, you're scaring me. What exactly did you hear? I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I heard Emma's voice, but it wasn't Emma. It was coming from the woods, and it sounded wrong, distorted. And then there was this growl. I trailed off, seeing the skepticism in Catherine's eyes. She glanced at Emma, who was now watching us intently, then back to me. James, Emma's been here the whole time. You must have imagined it. I know what I heard, I insisted, my voice rising. Catherine, please, we need to get the kids and go. Something's not right here. Before she could respond, a loud thump came from upstairs, followed by William's terrified scream. Without hesitation, I bolted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, Catherine close behind me. We burst into the kids' room to find William huddled in the corner, his eyes fixed on the window. The curtains billowed in the wind. The window I'd closed earlier was now wide open. Will, I rushed to him, pulling him into my arms. What happened? Are you okay? He clung to me, his small body shaking. There was a face at the window, Dad. It looked like Emma, but wrong. Its eyes were all black and its mouth was too big. I felt the blood drain from my face. Catherine gasped behind me, instinctively moving to check the window. She leaned out, looking in all directions before pulling back in and slamming it shut. There's nothing out there, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But, James, maybe you're right. Maybe we should go. I nodded, relief flooding through me. Okay, let's grab what we need, and my words were cut off by a deafening crash from downstairs, followed by Emma's piercing scream. Catherine and I exchanged a horrified look before racing back down the stairs, William clinging to my back. The scene that greeted us in the kitchen turned my blood to ice. The back door had been smashed inward, wood splinters scattered across the floor. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure that defied description. It was roughly human-shaped, but too tall, too thin. Its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in hands with fingers like talons. But it was the face that sent waves of terror crashing over me. It was Emma's face, but twisted, distorted. The eyes were bottomless pits of darkness, the mouth a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. Emma was backed into a corner, her small face contorted with fear. The creature took a step towards her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Get away from her, I roared, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy cast iron skillet, and hurling it at the thing. The pan struck it squarely in the head, and for a moment the air seemed to shimmer around it. Its form flickered like a bad television signal before solidifying again. It turned its attention to me, those black eyes boring into my soul. And then it spoke, in that horrible, distorted version of my daughter's voice. Why won't you help me, Daddy? Don't you love me? I felt my sanity begin to fray at the edges. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But the terror on my family's faces, the splintered door, the cold wind whipping through the kitchen, it was all too visceral to be a nightmare. You're not my daughter, I growled, positioning myself between the creature and my family. I don't know what you are, but you need to leave. Now. The thing cocked its head to one side, an eerily human gesture that sent shivers down my spine. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile, far too wide for any human face. But I am your daughter, Daddy, it said, taking another step forward. I'm just improved. Don't you want to be improved too, all of you? From behind me I heard Catherine's shaky voice. James, the car keys, we need to go. I nodded almost imperceptibly, not taking my eyes off the creature. In my jacket pocket, I whispered back, by the front door. The creature took another step forward, its distorted features twisting into something that might have been curiosity. Why are you whispering, Daddy? Don't you want to play with me? I felt William's grip on my leg tighten, his small body trembling against me. Emma whimpered from her corner, and I could hear Catherine's ragged breathing behind me. We were trapped, cornered by this impossible thing that wore my daughter's face like a grotesque mask. Catherine, I said, my voice low and steady despite the fear coursing through me. When I say go, take the kids and run for the car. Don't look back, don't stop for anything, just go. I didn't wait for her response. In one fluid motion, I lunged forward, grabbing the heavy wooden chair from the dining table and swinging it with all my might at the creature. Go, I roared. The chair connected with a sickening crunch, and for a moment, the creature's form seemed to waver, like a mirage in the desert. It stumbled backward, its inhuman screech piercing the night air. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I turned and ran, following the sounds of my family's frantic footsteps. Catherine had Emma in her arms, William clinging to her side as they raced for the front door. I scooped up my jacket, fumbling for the keys as we burst out onto the front porch. The night air hit us like a physical force, cold and damp. The woods around us seemed alive with movement, shadows flickering between the trees. From inside the cabin came a sound like tearing metal, followed by that horrible, distorted voice. "Daddy, why are you running? Don't leave me." "The car," I shouted, tossing the keys to Catherine. "Start it up." She caught them one-handed, never breaking stride as she ran towards our SUV parked in the gravel driveway. I brought up the rear, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting at any moment to see that twisted figure emerging from the cabin. Catherine reached the car first, fumbling with the keys for a heart-stopping moment before managing to unlock it. She wrenched open the back door, practically throwing Emma inside before helping William scramble in after her. I was just steps away when I heard it, a rustling in the undergrowth to my left, followed by a low, inhuman growl. I didn't look. I didn't dare. I just ran harder, my lungs burning, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst from my chest. I reached the car just as Catherine was sliding into the driver's seat. I threw myself into the passenger side, slamming the door shut behind me. "Go," I yelled. "Drive." The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness. Catherine threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the loose gravel. As we backed up, the headlights swept across the front of the cabin, and for a split second I saw it. The creature stood in the doorway, its elongated limbs and distorted face a nightmarish silhouette. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, more shapes moved in the shadows, tall and twisted, their eyes gleaming in the light. Catherine let out a strangled gasp, slamming the gear shift into drive. The tires screeched as we peeled out of the driveway, the car fishtailing slightly before finding purchase on the dirt road. I turned in my seat, watching through the rear window as the cabin receded into the distance. The last thing I saw before we rounded a bend was a group of those impossible figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching us go. "Daddy?" Emma's small, trembling voice came from the back seat. What was that thing?" I turned back, meeting my daughter's tear-filled eyes in the rearview mirror. How could I explain what we'd just experienced? How could I make sense of it when I didn't understand it myself? "I don't know, sweetheart," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "But it's gone now. We're safe." As we sped through the dark forest heading for the main road and civilization beyond, I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. Whatever had invaded our peaceful family getaway, whatever impossibility had worn my daughter's face like a mask, it had changed everything. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a chilling thought took root. What if it followed us home? The drive back to our home in Manchester was a blur of tension and whispered reassurances. Catherine white-knuckled the steering wheel, her eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror as if expecting to see those twisted figures materializing on the road behind us. In the back seat, William and Emma huddled together, occasionally whimpering or asking in small, frightened voices if the monsters were gone. I kept my gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the headlights, searching for any sign of pursuit, any hint that the horrors we'd left behind at the cabin had followed us. But as the miles stretched on and the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps we had escaped. We pulled into our driveway just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. The familiar sight of our modest two-story home with its well-tended garden and cheerful yellow door seemed surreal after the nightmarish events of the past few hours. "We're home," Catherine announced, her voice cracking with exhaustion and lingering fear. "We're safe now." But were we? The question gnawed at me as we ushered the children inside, as we checked and double-checked every lock, as we drew all the curtains tight against the growing daylight. The rational part of my mind insisted that what we'd experienced couldn't be real. It defied all logic, all known laws of nature. Yet the terror in my family's eyes, the vivid memory of that distorted, impossible creature, told a different story. As Catherine busied herself making breakfast, a semblance of normalcy in the wake of chaos, I retreated to my home office, closing the door behind me. My hands shook as I booted up my computer, my mind racing. I needed answers, needed to make sense of what had happened. I spent hours scouring the internet, searching for any accounts similar to our experience. I delved into folklore, into obscure paranormal forums, into scientific articles about perception and hallucination. But nothing I found could adequately explain what we'd encountered. A soft knock at the door startled me from my research. "James?" Catherine's voice was muffled through the wood. "Can we talk?" I opened the door to find my wife standing there, her face etched with worry and fatigue. The children were napping, she informed me, finally succumbing to exhaustion after hours of nervous energy and tears. "What do we do now?" she asked as we sat on the small love seat in my office. Do we tell someone? The police? My parents? Yours?" I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of our shared trauma pressing down on me. "Who would believe us, Catherine? We barely believe it ourselves, and we lived through it." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I keep thinking, what if we hadn't gotten out? What if that thing had taken Emma or William? What was it, James? How is any of this possible?" I pulled her close, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're together, we're safe. That's what matters right now." But even as I said the words, doubt gnawed at me. Were we truly safe, or had we merely delayed the inevitable? The days that followed were a strange mix of forced normalcy and underlying tension. We went through the motions of our daily lives, work, school, household chores, but always with one eye on the shadows, always with a lingering fear that at any moment our world might again be turned upside down. The children were resilient, as children often are. Within a week, Emma was back to her bubbly, energetic self, though she now insisted on sleeping with a nightlight. William was quieter, more introspective. I often caught him staring out windows, his young face creased with a worry no child should have to bear. Catherine and I did our best to present a united, calm front for the kids, but in private, the strain began to show. We argued more, snapping at each other over trivial things. Sleep became a luxury, our nights plagued by vivid nightmares that left us gasping and sweat-soaked. And always, there was the nagging fear that it wasn't over, that someday, somehow, that twisted thing with my daughter's face would find us again. It was nearly 2 weeks after our escape from the cabin when the first sign came that our fears might be justified. I was in the backyard, absent-mindedly weeding the vegetable garden, when I heard it. A faint, distorted giggle that seemed to come from the wooded area beyond our property line. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned towards the sound, my eyes scanning the tree line. For a moment I saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something tall and impossibly thin slipped between 2 trees, there and gone in an instant. I blinked, convinced I must be imagining things. But then I saw it again, a pale, elongated figure, just at the edge of my vision. And this time, I could have sworn it waved at me, its 2 long fingers curling in a grotesque parody of a friendly gesture. I stumbled backwards, nearly falling in my haste to get back to the house. I slammed and locked the door behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "James?" Catherine called from upstairs. "Is everything okay?" I opened my mouth to respond, to warn her, to tell her we needed to run again, but before I could form the words, a sound from outside stopped me cold. It was Emma's voice, but wrong, distorted and electronic, just as it had been that night at the cabin. "Daddy?" it called. "Why did you leave me in the woods? Don't you want to play?" As Catherine's footsteps sounded on the stairs, as I heard the children stirring in their rooms, I realized with a sinking heart that our nightmare was far from over. It had followed us home. The weeks that followed our return from the cabin were a slow descent into paranoia and fear. Every shadow held potential menace. Every unexpected sound sent our hearts racing. We became prisoners in our own home, drawing the curtains tight against the outside world, jumping at every creak of the house settling or whisper of wind through the trees. I threw myself into research, spending countless hours poring over obscure texts on folklore and the paranormal, desperate for any information that might help us understand and hopefully combat whatever had followed us home. Catherine, ever practical, focused on fortifying our defenses. She installed new locks on all the doors and windows, set up a complex security system, and even went so far as to salt the perimeter of our property. A protective measure she'd read about in one of my books. The children, bless their resilient souls, seemed to be coping better than we were. Emma's nightmares had largely subsided, though she still insisted on sleeping with her bedroom door open and a nightlight blazing. William had become our unofficial lookout, his young eyes constantly scanning the tree line beyond our backyard, alert for any sign of the impossible creatures we'd encountered. But despite our best efforts, the incidents continued. They were small at first, a child's laughter echoing through the house when both kids were at school, shadows moving against the laws of physics, objects disappearing and reappearing in impossible places. We tried to rationalize these events to convince ourselves they were just tricks of an overactive imagination. But deep down, we knew better. It was a month after our escape from the cabin when things escalated dramatically. I was in my home office poring over yet another esoteric tome when I heard Catherine scream from the kitchen. I raced downstairs to find her backed against the refrigerator, her face pale with terror. "The window," she whispered, pointing with a shaking hand. I turned, following her gaze to the large bay window that overlooked our backyard. For a moment I saw nothing but the familiar view of our garden and the woods beyond. Then movement caught my eye. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. But not just any face. It was Emma's face, distorted and wrong, just as it had been on that creature at the cabin. The eyes were black pits, the mouth stretched impossibly wide in a rictus grin. As I watched, frozen in horror, a hand, too large, fingers too long and sharp, pressed against the glass next to the face. "Daddy," came that horrible electronic voice muffled through the window. "Let me in. I want to play." Catherine let out a choked sob behind me. I wanted to run, to grab her and the kids and flee, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only stand there, staring at this impossible thing that wore my daughter's face like a mask. The creature's grin widened even further, its jaw unhinging like a snake's. "Don't you love me anymore, Daddy?" it asked, its voice a twisted parody of Emma's sweet tones. "Don't you want to be a family again?" A high, keening wail broke the spell that held me paralyzed. Emma, our Emma, the real Emma, stood in the doorway, her small face contorted in terror as she stared at her doppelganger. The thing at the window turned its attention to her, its black eyes gleaming with an emotion I couldn't name. Hunger? Anticipation? Whatever it was, it snapped me out of my stupor. "Get the kids!" I barked at Catherine, already moving to place myself between the window and my family. "Get them to the car, now!" She didn't hesitate, scooping up Emma and calling for William as she ran for the front of the house. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the creature at the window. It watched me go, that terrible smile never wavering. As I reached the doorway, I heard a sound that chilled me to my core, the slow, deliberate creak of the back door opening. We always kept it locked, always. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear something behind me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst out the front door to find Catherine struggling to get the kids into the car. William was refusing to get in, insisting he needed to go back for his favorite stuffed animal. Emma was wailing, clinging to her mother's neck. "Get in the car!" I yelled, not slowing as I raced towards them. "Now!" The urgency in my voice must have gotten through to William. He climbed into the back seat just as I reached them. I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as Catherine slammed her door shut. As the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up to see a group of figures emerging from around the side of the house. They were tall, impossibly thin, their limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. And each one wore a face I recognized. Distorted, twisted versions of our neighbors, our friends, even my parents. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as we peeled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creatures gather on our front lawn, watching us go. The one in front, the one wearing Emma's face, raised a hand in a mocking wave. As we sped down the street, leaving behind our home and everything we knew, a single thought echoed through my mind. Where could we go? Where in this world could we possibly be safe? We drove for hours. putting as much distance between us and our home as possible. The children eventually fell into an uneasy sleep in the back seat, but Catherine and I remained alert, our eyes constantly scanning the road and the darkening sky for any sign of pursuit. "Where are we going?" Catherine asked softly, careful not to wake the kids. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "I don't know," I admitted. I don't know." We ended up at a small motel just outside of Portland, Maine. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions when you paid in cash and gave a false name. As I checked us in, Catherine sat in the car with the children, her eyes never leaving the shadows between the buildings. That night, huddled together in a small, musty room, we tried to make sense of our situation. The children, exhausted by fear and confusion, fell asleep quickly. Catherine and I sat at the small table by the window, speaking in hushed tones. "What are they?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling. "How is any of this possible?" I shook my head, feeling the weight of my inability to protect my family pressing down on me. "I don't know. Nothing I've read, nothing I've researched comes close to explaining what we've seen. Can we go to the police?" The hope in her voice was heartbreaking. Catherine buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I reached across the table, taking her hands in mine. "We'll figure this out," I said, trying to inject confidence I didn't feel into my voice. "We'll find a way to stop them, to protect our family." But even as I spoke the words, doubt gnawed at me. How could we fight something we didn't understand, something that defied all laws of nature and reason? The next few days passed in a blur of constant movement. We never stayed in one place for more than a night, always looking over our shoulders, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. We drove aimlessly, crisscrossing New England, hoping that if we kept moving, the things pursuing us wouldn't be able to find us. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. It was on the 5th night of our flight that it happened. We had stopped at a small campground in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, reasoning that the isolation might provide some safety. As night fell, we huddled around a small campfire, the children roasting marshmallows in an attempt at normalcy. That's when we heard it, a twig snapping in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. William tensed, his young eyes scanning the tree line. Emma scooted closer to Catherine, whimpering softly. "It's probably just an animal," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. From the darkness came that familiar, distorted voice. "Daddy, Mommy, why did you run away? Don't you love us anymore?" Emma let out a terrified cry, burying her face in Catherine's chest. William stood up, his small fists clenched at his sides. "You're not our family," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "Go away." A chilling laugh echoed through the trees, seeming to come from all directions at once. "But we are your family now," the voice said. "The only family you'll ever need." And then they emerged from the darkness, a group of those twisted, impossible creatures. They wore the faces of our friends, our neighbors, our relatives, all distorted and wrong. At the front was the one with Emma's face, its black eyes reflecting the firelight. I stood, placing myself between the creatures and my family. "What do you want from us?" I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. The Emma thing cocked its head to one side, that terrible smile widening. "We want you to join us," it said, "to become like us, to be free from the limitations of your fragile human forms." "Never," Catherine spat, holding Emma close. The creature's smile didn't waver. "You don't have a choice," it said. "You've seen us now. You know we exist. There's no going back." As it spoke, the other creatures began to move forward, their movements jerky and unnatural. I looked around frantically, searching for any means of escape, any weapon we could use. But we were surrounded, cut off from the car, from any hope of flight. In that moment, as the creatures closed in and my family huddled behind me, I realized something. These things, whatever they were, fed on our fear. They thrived on the terror they inspired, on the way they made us doubt our own sanity. Taking a deep breath, I straightened my spine and looked the Emma thing directly in its black eyes. "No," I said, my voice firm and clear. "We reject you. We reject what you are and what you represent. You have no power over us." For a moment, the creature's smile faltered. It took a step back, confusion evident on its twisted features. Emboldened, Catherine stepped up beside me. "We are not afraid of you," she declared. "You are nothing to us." William and Emma, brave beyond their years, joined us. "Go away," William said. "You're not real." "We don't believe in you," Emma added, her small voice strong and sure. As we stood there, united in our defiance, something incredible happened. The creatures began to waver, their forms becoming insubstantial, like mirages in the desert heat. The Emma thing let out a horrible, inhuman shriek as its body seemed to dissolve into mist. One by one, the creatures faded away, their screams echoing through the night until, finally, we were alone in the quiet of the forest. We stood there for a long moment, hardly daring to believe it was over. Then slowly we sank to the ground, holding each other close as the enormity of what had just happened washed over us. In the days and weeks that followed, we slowly pieced our lives back together. We returned home, cleansed the house with sage and salt, and tried to find our way back to normalcy. It wasn't easy. The memories of what we'd experienced lingered, coloring our perceptions and haunting our dreams. But we had each other, and we had the knowledge that we had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. Whatever those creatures had been, hallucinations, interdimensional beings, or something else entirely, we had proven stronger. As I sit here now, years later, writing down this account, I can't help but wonder if we'll ever truly understand what happened to us. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, but I know this. The love of family, the strength found in unity, and the power of belief are forces more potent than any horror this world or any other can conjure. And if someday we hear that distorted voice calling from the shadows again, we'll be ready. For we know now that the greatest weapon against the darkness is the light we carry within ourselves.